Chapter 2007. Published at 19th of July 2023 8:53 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 2007. Good timing. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's gaze shifted to the force art slowly shrinking beneath his feet. He realized that he probably had one more strike in him if he did so now, but it would only be about half as strong as the one just now. Depending on the situation in battle, he'll have to adjust that. Whether I grow more efficient at releasing it all at once, or hold back on the first strike so that I can have a second. Either way, I'll just have to keep those thoughts tucked in the back of my mind. Lionel subtly nodded to himself and stepped down from the skies. In the past, he still had to rely on his emulation spatial force to step into the air, but he could now do it on his own. Aside from those with flying ability indexes, he was probably the only one of the sixth dimension who could do this without relying on force itself, but rather a comprehension of force. This, though, made it clearer to Lionel the kind of gap that existed between the sixth and seventh dimensions. He still remembered a time he could just barely battle against those of the fifth dimension when he was still in the third. But now this small gap had actually caused him so much trouble. From the sixth dimension onward, every step was fundamentally different and world-changing. Flying was an ability only those who used the God path and had stepped into the seventh dimension could perform. There was something metaphysical that changed in a person's being. Lionel had stepped into that realm just now relying on his comprehension, but others had undergone this change with their bodies. When this was put into perspective, the large gap between what seemed to be just a single step made much more sense. On the ground, Radley shook his head. He had just stepped out from a pod himself as these last 2 days had been really taxing for him. He didn't expect to see Lionel entering Tier 9 right before his eyes. It had to be remembered that not even a year ago, he had witnessed Lionel going from Tier 1 to Tier 3 right before his eyes, and now he was already in Tier 9, right after he had already stepped into Tier 8. It would be easier to accept if he had taken the conventional path, but this was very clearly not that. His aura was too powerful and his momentum was far too stifling. Radley's had never met anyone in the first tiers of the seventh dimension with a stronger aura than Lionel. By the time Lionel had landed, his light smile had vanished into the same cold expression he had carried for much of the air wars. He could allow the time he had just wasted to go because he had exchanged it for more strength, but in general he didn't want to waste any more time. Now that he was in Tier 9, he had much more confidence. The only unfortunate part was that he didn't have the next layers of dimensional cleanse. To Lionel, the actual process of going through tiers didn't necessitate dimensional cleanse, but the breakthrough process did. In addition, Lionel had yet to fully comprehend the sixth dimensional layer of dimensional cleanse either. He had done so for the fifth dimensional layer, allowing him to pass it on to others, but he had yet to even actively practice the sixth dimensional layer, let alone comprehend it. I think you should take a look at Panda's novel. He simply had too much to do and he was always busy. If not for his sharp comprehension, making it to Tier 9 in such a short time would have been nothing more than a good joke. Lionel slotted this matter to the back of his mind. It seemed like just as he had with the fifth dimensional layer, he would have to practice it last minute. That said, that didn't mean that he had no idea of how he might proceed forward. After all, dimensional cleanse was clearly very closely tied with the universal cycle comprehension and methods of the Cataclysm Zone. Panda's novel. This meant that the next step likely involved taking his stars and crossing from the heavenly body realm into the natural light realm. Then to enter the seventh dimension he would need to shatter them and enter the cosmos realm. If that was the case, even if he wanted to, Lionel wouldn't be able to practice the sixth dimensional layer of dimensional cleanse. That was because he still hadn't gained enlightenment on the natural light realm. Radley's continue to monitor the situation on the night side continent. I'll provide the points. I want you to build a bride of outposts between the edge of our territory and the opposing shoreline. Use those outposts as your method of quickly returning here. I want a report every 6 hours. You can connect it right here. Lionel pointed out several things on the map and then relayed a few more orders. After he was done, he sent Radley's and the other members of the Umbra family away. Outposts could only be set up such that some part of their range was within a range of territory you already owned, so Lionel had no choice but to waste the points needed to build an entire bridge across the ocean just for the sake of this convenience. But right now, information was extremely important to him. In addition, given the fact that the outposts would be hidden under the ocean's tides, the likelihood of them being found was minimal, and even if they were found. So what? He really wanted to see who would dare to attack him casually right now. Lionel's gaze flashed with a fierce light. At that moment, several teleportation signals were received and flashes of light rippled out as those Lionel had sent out to clear the challenges and dungeons began to return. Lionel nodded to himself. This timing was good. He would take the time to maximize the rewards they had gained first before heading out to hunt more air-grade threats. Chapter 2008. Published at 19th of July 2023 8:53 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 2008. Huge deal if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The first thing the others brought back was quite interesting. It was a water freezing reward. It was exceptionally difficult to freeze salted water for obvious reasons, and oceans in higher dimensional worlds were even more resistant to such things. The Air Wars planet had poles, but they weren't frozen over as one might expect, or more accurately, the waters that ran through it weren't. This wasn't only because the waters were salted, but also because the ocean of this world was akin to a very wide river, constantly moving about and orbiting the planet. The freeze reward came from an air-grade dungeon, and it could be used in two ways. The first was to build a bridge. If Lionel wanted to, he could build an ice bridge from his current territory to the other side of the ocean. This bridge would be exceptionally deep and thick. Destroying it would be hundreds of times more difficult than breaking down the walls of an air-grade city. The second use case was to build an ice island. This island would be even more immutable and nigh indestructible. Though its range would obviously be much shorter than that of the ice bridge, it would still be about 10 kilometers in diameter. In addition, this ice island would come with its own city core, allowing one to build a territory upon it. This city would be unique. Rather than receiving 100 times reduction to one's territory, the reduction would only be 10 times. This meant if Lionel had a city transfer reward and displaced his city to the ice island, the 2,000 kilometer range he had that had been limited to 20 kilometers would become 200 kilometers instead. This was quite an exceptional benefit. After all, Lionel had to spend 30 billion points previously to gain just 300 kilometers of range. He would gain 2/3 of that essentially for free if he could get a transfer reward. The width of the ocean was easily over 500 kilometers. It wrapped around the entire planet as well, so its length was easily over 3,000 kilometers. Even so, this would go a long way. If Lionel could block out a section of the ocean with more than just outposts, the benefit would be exceptional and also stop others from encroaching without a willingness to bear arms. Even so, Lionel set this matter aside for a small time. The next reward was actually quite an excellent one. It was an air-grade protector. This was worth a great deal. An air-grade protector was worth easily 10 of just one of the soul constructs he had gathered until now. Even better than that, their defensive abilities were off the charts, so ultimately, their combat strength was better than just the estimate of 10 Lionel had. It would probably be able to deal with a fifth of the air-grade generals come the air-grade upgrade challenge. Lionel crushed the rewards and released it, allowing it to join the other lower-grade protectors. Though they were invisible for now, when the time came they should be quite useful. The next few rewards were miscellaneous, but useful nonetheless. This included an air-grade city wall collapse reward, a territory expanding reward, and a gold-grade upgrade pass. The territory expanding reward was especially interesting because it was air-grade. It allowed one to expand their territory as though one already had an air-grade city. The territory of an air-grade city was measured differently. The gold grade had a limit of 2,000 kilometers even after one exchanged points for more expansion. But an air-grade territory encompassed a continent. Meaning, if Lionel used this reward, so long as there weren't the territories of others present, his territory would expand to engulf a continent. The trouble with this, though, was that Lionel's goal was obviously the ocean, and this reward wouldn't allow him to claim the entire ocean for obvious reasons. But as a reward from an ocean dungeon, there was obviously a provision for it to be used in this fashion. I think you should take a look at Panda's novel. This was when Lionel learned that the ocean was split into 4 seas according to this description, each sea taking up a fourth of its length. According to the reward, if he attached this territory expansion to a special ocean territory, he would be able to claim up to an entire sea for himself. Lionel's gaze flickered when he read through this. That was because he had access to one such thing already, and that would be the Ice Island City. That said, there was a bit of a drawback. He would only be able to claim half of a sea with a gold-grade city. In order to claim a whole sea, he would need an air-grade territory. Lionel fell into thought. He had access to more than enough cities now, although he didn't use them. There was his decoy city which he could upgrade now with his gold-grade upgrade pass. After that, he would only need to find one more city to trigger the air-grade upgrade challenge. Panda's novel calm, but there were 2 major problems with this. First, this would obviously make the air-grade upgrade challenge 3 times more difficult, and he was still accumulating to challenge even the base-level challenge. Unfortunately, he was still an enormous amount of points away from being able to afford it, and he was constantly spending points now, the Bride of Outposts just being one matter. The second issue was that challenging with a special ocean territory meant that he would have to deal with oceanic beasts instead of land beasts. They would be a huge headache for obvious reasons, and his formation wasn't here to support him. However, claiming an entire city was a huge deal, that was especially since this reward didn't say anything about being limited by the territories of others. That likely meant that even if there was someone encroaching on his sea right this moment, they would be kicked out. This was a huge deal. Lionel fell into silence. Chapter 2009. Published at 19th of July 2023 8:55 and 19 seconds AM. Chapter 2009. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2009. Battle intent. Lionel had to function with the assumption that if he could accomplish something, although he was ahead now, that didn't mean others couldn't accomplish it in the future. In fact, there were probably multiple paths to accomplish the same thing. That meant in the future there would likely be others claiming seas, and Lionel knew that he had to be one of them. More importantly, he had to be the first among them. Right now, the only advantage he had outside of his own combat strength was that he was the first to form a gold-grade territory. But if he was complacent, soon, others would begin to catch up. If he idled any longer, his advantage would be swallowed up. This was why he had taken the risk to march on the Dayside continent in the first place. However, this decision was still many times more difficult. The simple fact was that he didn't see a simple path toward clearing the air-grade upgrade challenge, let alone 3 times it. He had fought the air-grade threats personally just now. They were monsters. With the improvements to his strength, he could likely take one down easily now, but a single wave would have 100, a fusion challenge would have 300. Most of his subordinates couldn't battle even a single gold-grade threat, let alone 300 air-grade threats. That didn't mention the other elephant in the room. 100 million gold-grade threats, or 300 million in this case. That was the population of a decently sized country back on Earth. In the grand scheme of the human domain, it was a small number, but it was a crushing mountain to the current Lionel. Even if he had the option, he wouldn't be able to control that many soul constructs either, even if he factored in the recent improvement to his dream force. Lionel took a breath and exhaled, closing his eyes. This had to be done. The only thought process now should be figuring out how. His eyes snapped open and his focus seemed to have increased. He scanned through the remaining rewards, most of which were still miscellaneous, until he landed on one. This reward was in the shape of a conch one could blow into. There were 2 options. The first was to summon 10 air-grade threats, the other was to summon 1 million gold-grade threats. All of them would be oceanic beasts. Lionel's gaze narrowed. It seems that I'll have to bring out one more of my trump cards. Those watching likely had no idea just how much Lionel was holding back currently. He had many methods that he hadn't used, but that was because he was aware that he was being observed and his goal was never just to win the air wars. His eyes had been on the war that was doubtless to follow once he did win. In his eyes, this was nothing more than a precursor. But in order to assure his victory, it seemed he would have to bring out a bit more. He raised the conch to his lips. His chest expanded and he practically roared into its body. A billowing sound that caused the ocean to become agitated echoed time and time again. Then, he lowered it. You all go and rest. When you feel refreshed, continue with the same plan. Well, keep pushing forward like this. There'll only be just one slight change. The rewards from dungeons are less predictable and there's no reproducibility. Focus on challenges for now, namely challenges with the highest possibility of producing upgrade clear rewards. Once we've found one more gold grade upgrade challenge clear reward and a territory displacement reward, change your focus back to dungeons. The others nodded and Lionel handed a ring to Aina. Aina, these are the corpses of the air grade threats I've dealt with until now. From now on, I won't kill them. Is this enough? Aina swept her senses into it and looked up with a nod. It's enough. This will last me a very long time. Good. Lionel nodded before flickering and vanishing. Lionel appeared on the tall city walls, looking down to the churning waters below. I think you should take a look at Panda's novel. Come one after another, large oceanic beasts began to appear. Each was at least 20 meters large and they were all stingrays glistening with a silvery black color. Panda's novel. These stingrays were all gold-grade threats and with the conch by his side, they were all under Lionel's control. Lionel hopped down from the city walls and landed on the back of one. He inspected it for a moment before diving below the raging waters. The scene below could only be described as fascinating. These stingrays went for as far as the eye could see, especially in these dark waters. Their majesty was great and their beauty greater, but this wouldn't do much to help Lionel. He tested it just now and the amount of control he had over these stingrays was incredibly limited. At best, he could point them toward a direction to attack and he could group them up. As for how they attacked, that was left up to them. This army of 1 million seemed majestic, but they would get chewed up and spit out by an army of 300 million. Even the 3 million from Lionel's gold grade challenge would have laid waste to them. However, Lionel still inspected them all one by one. If one was paying attention to his mind, it would be possible to see a perfect replica of each stingray being carefully slotted away. They were accurate down the finest millimeter, completely flawless. After several moments, Lionel resurfaced. He commanded the stingrays to stay near the surface and avoid running into the territory of the ocean beasts below. If he lost a few of them for a stupid reason, it would be too late to regret. Lionel appeared back with his city and exhaled a breath. Each stingray was a slightly different size. It seemed that he couldn't rely on the segmented cube this time. Although it might be possible to create something simple like a collar with an adjustable size and mass produce it that way, the effects wouldn't be what he wanted. The power would be limited. Lionel's gaze glowed. It seemed he would have to act personally again. As for Lionel's plan, it was about time he put an idea that had been swimming in mind to action. Back in the Cataclysm Zone, he had seen a concept for armors that could allow troops to fuse their power into one and output more strength than just the sum of their parts. It was akin to working in formation, but with warriors being the nodes instead of something else. If he wanted to clear the air grade upgrade challenge as quickly as possible, he would have to create an army of gold grade threats that could destroy a threat 300 times their size. Little Tolly squirmed from its position on Lionel's wrist, clearly feeling Lionel's battle intent. Or, maybe, it should be called crafting intent. A cold smile spread across Lionel's lips. These old bastards would have to watch carefully now. The number one crafter of the younger generation had been him for a very long while. If they truly thought he had opponents, they would be in for a rude awakening. Chapter 2010. Published at 19th of July 2023 8:55 and 20 a.m. Chapter 2010. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2010. True talent. Little Tolly snaked out from around Lionel's wrist, spreading into the skies. This little one had been noticed by everyone long ago. But it only now seemed to click that Lionel didn't have the slightest protection on his body. He came into direct contact with little Tolly without the slightest worry. His synergy with his metal spirit was as high as it could be. But what was maybe even more shocking than this was the fact little Tolly was still only in the 5th dimension. What was Lionel planning to do with such a weak metal spirit? They had seen Lionel use little Tolly before, but back then Lionel was only bending a metal alloy into shape, and that metal wasn't necessarily designed to be hard and sturdy, it was only created for the sake of facilitating his dream world. But now, Lionel's gaze flashed. He didn't even seem intent on using a workbench. In his mind, several blueprints flashed and then vanished before flashing once again. He refined, shattered, and then rebuilt. Lionel tapped at the air as little Tolly circled his neck before rising high into the skies. At that moment, the grid of his emulation spatial force appeared once again. Quickly, Lionel settled upon design began to appear. It was in the shape of an odd winged armor. There was a strong spine that ran down the back and looked like a sapphire blue set of spinal bones locked into one another. Each ended in a menacing blade, and despite the fact it was just a projection, the sharpness seemed to tear into the eyes of those watching. After a moment of astonishment, it suddenly clicked. This sort of armor wasn't for humans, it was for the stingrays. Their eyes couldn't help but open wide. That was impossible. Setting aside the fact creating an armor you weren't used to was an almost impossible task, doing so for 1,000,000 existence was an endeavor that should have taken years of effort. Even if you sped it up, it should take months. Even if you completed an armor a second, completing 1,000,000 of them would take over a week, nearing 2, let alone the fact it would take several hours to complete just one. Even if you managed to complete one an hour, a pace that could only be said to be blazing, it would take over a century. They couldn't fathom what Lionel was trying to do. Even if he had a method to speed up these timetables by several factors, several months would still be an overly exaggerated estimate. But even then, several months might be enough time for the entire air wars to come to an end. At that point, should Lionel have a better go-to than this? Unless this was really all he had. The Morales ancestors could only sigh. Lionel had truly done quite excellently until now, but much more couldn't be asked of him. If he was in the 7th dimension, the winners seemed to be clear to them already. But even though he was in Tier 9 now, even if it was adjusted for his insane speed, several months would be an outrageous estimate for how fast he could enter the 7th dimension. Most were stuck for decades to even centuries at this step. Even the Cataclysm generation geniuses were stuck for at least 5 to 7 years on average at that step. However, right then, Lionel began to move. Pandas novel. His arms flared out and his hands trembled once. A golden glow formed a layer of his hands before separating. Right then, a perfect replica of Lionel's hands appeared in the air beside his Real's once. Then there was a second glow, then a third. I think you should take a look at Panda's novel. Come in the blink of an eye, 999 pairs of hands appeared in the skies, with Lionel's own making exactly 1,000. You can handle it right, little guy? Bloop bloop little Tolly's body shuddered once before a raging torrent formed. The skies seemed to be blotted out by a silvery tsunami, casting a shadow over a large swath of the city. Lionel grinned. Little Tolly might still be in the 5th dimension, but it was only ever fed the highest quality materials. Its foundation was incredibly solid, and the only reason it hadn't entered the 6th dimension was because Lionel was still trying to find a force eruption to allow it the perfect evolution. Metal spirits were exceptionally dangerous existences. They could even swallow planets if they were allowed to rampage unchecked. There was a reason Lionel's casual actions around it were seen as so shocking. And now, Lionel had fully unleashed it. Little Tolly could already break into dozens of pieces back when Lionel was still in the 3rd dimension, but now, even breaking into 1,000 wasn't a problem. Lionel's gaze glowed and countless ores appeared in the air. He had traded for so many with his points until now that he hadn't even used up 1/10 of what he had in reserve. He had more than he knew what to do with, and they were about to be of great use. Lionel's 1,000 pair of hands flexed just once, and as though striking down toward the keys of a piano, they shattered the sound barrier on the way down, a roar that echoed across the continent and through the oceans, rising in a torrent. Bang! 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 Little Tolly's countless pieces surged forward, its processing speed under Lionel's control immaculate. A heartfelt silence reigned. It felt as though there was simply nothing else to say. Seeing Lionel's skill for the first time, Cynthia's expression changed for the first time, her heart skipping a beat. They had all seen Lionel break through in emulation spatial force together. This meant that Lionel had only just gained the skill to use several pairs of hands like this so seamlessly. And yet he was not only skilled enough to execute such a thing, but he was also doing so with such confidence. How much self-assurance must one have to try something you had never done before with your fate on the line before the eyes of trillions? It was then that she realized the scariest thing about Lionel wasn't his lineage, nor was it his talent. Chapter 2011. Published at 19th of July 2023 8:55 and 20 a.m. Chapter 2011. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2011. Without fail, Lionel was incomparably focused. His fingers tapped at slightly different rhythms, but each of their speeds was blinding. The ores before him were quickly heated, each of them being shed of their impurities. The way he approached purification now and the past was vastly different. Before, his only focus was making the ore shine in its own personal strongest light. But now, he saw things several steps ahead. Sometimes, he would even purposely leave impurities behind, knowing that certain changes would actually aid this or to better bind with the future pieces of the alloy. This was what it meant to have entered the life grade, comprehending the holistic view of your creation rather than dealing with individual portions. His actions moved smoothly from one step to the next. Despite the fact he was working with such a large amount of materials considering the size of the stingrays, he finished the purification process in not even 10 minutes. His speed could only be said to be mind-numbing. However, the results for those in the crowd who were laymen was underwhelming. Even from here they could see that many impurities were left behind, but they felt that this was likely the best Lionel could do given the circumstances. Only time would tell if the results would be good enough. Despite the feelings of these laymen, the Morales ancestors and the Force Crafting Guild crafters had all stood to their feet, their eyes wide as they moved forward as though they needed to get a closer glance. Lionel was keeping this relatively simple, working with just 3 6-dimensional ores, and, of course, using herb ore as a foundation. It was for partly this reason that his actions seemed to be so desperate. What could silver-grade treasures do to meaningfully change his situation at the moment? 2 of these ores were water-based, while the third was a water-wind fusion that was particularly unruly. This third ore was known as green storm ore, and what made it even odder was the fact it was a vein-type oregano. The laymen weren't able to see the subtle actions Lionel was taking, but how could this meant that it wasn't only unruly, but one had to be delicate and finely controlled in its usage. Vein-type ores were usually built into the core of treasures and used to write out the most integral force arts to a craft. However, the method by which Lionel was refining it, and then subsequently fusing it with 2 foundational water force ores, was just genius. Lionel made the unruly ore look like a docile child. His mind worked on a plane of its own. The laymen weren't able to see the subtle actions Lionel was taking, but how could the ancestors not? They felt as though they were seeing a prodigy rising up before their eyes. Even until now, they couldn't quite comprehend how Lionel's armors were all of the life grade, but it seemed to suddenly click into place right this moment. The green storm ore was spun into a thin filament, so thin that it floated through the sky like a thread of silk, weightless and flexible. One after another, Lionel began to form the spinal bones of the armor, threading the green storm ore into the water force ores it should have clashed with. A beautiful pile of refined metals began to appear. They shimmered with blue, like sapphires sparkling beneath the ocean's surface. Within then, fine patterns of emerald glowed, giving it a mysterious appearance. At the same time, Lionel was refining one blade after another. This blade was formed by 2 wind force ores and yet another water wind ore that was once again green storm Oregon. Each blade was as thin as a cicada. They fluttered through the wind like a leaf, looking much more like the thin fins of a beautiful fish rather than the blades they were. With just a single jolt, they went from fragile and flexible to incredibly tough and sharp. The craftsmanship could only be described as gorgeous. The hours ticked by, and then over a day, but it seemed to finally click. Lionel didn't need months. By the end of the third day, he would be finished. The bags around Lionel's eyes were so dark that they had become a dense black. However, his fingers continued to strike with the same speed, large numbers of armors floating in the air with a renewed sort of vigor. Lionel's wrist trembled as a force crafting pen appeared. Suddenly, that force crafting pill multiplies, 2,000 appearing, one for each of his hands. He took a breath and exhaled before his hands suddenly began to move with lightning speed. The skies were filled with golden arcs and complex force arts were formed one after another like the gears of a pocket watch. The gazes of those shocked by Lionel's abilities turned to confusion. They had simply never seen such force arts before, it was completely foreign to them. They were even having trouble comprehending what they could do. Was this Lionel's trump card? Suddenly, Lionel's body froze and he fell backward, only to be caught in a soft embrace. However, by that point, he was already lightly snoring. Aina looked down with a hint of worry before looking up to the large pile of armors. Others would have a city filled with subordinates by now. The size of a gold-grade city was already enough to accommodate a population of millions. But Lionel's city was filled with these large armors instead. To forge 1,000,000 armors, even with 1,000 hands, was akin to each pair of hands completing an army every 4 to 5 minutes. Keeping up such a pace for over 72 hours. She could imagine the kind of burden he had taken on. However, while she was worried about Lionel's well-being, the human domain was in an uproar. After Lionel had finished those final strokes, the auras of the armors had solidified and took true form. Each one of those armors, without fail, was in the life grade. Chapter 2012. Published at 19th of July 2023 8:55 and 20 seconds AM. Chapter 2012. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2012. Blueprints. The commotion this caused was hard to describe. It felt as though Lionel Palm had suddenly descended from the skies, casting a shadow over all and gripping each one of their hearts one by one. Life-grade crafters were simply impossibly rare. In the whole of the human domain, the number of them weren't even close to 4 digits. In fact, they weren't even halfway there. The difficulty of crossing that final step was one that had stalled many for far too long. To put this matter into perspective, there were easily millions upon millions of gold-grade crafters, and yet not even 500 life-grade crafters. This was how solid this bottleneck was. There were some exceptionally rare geniuses who could cross this step while in the 7th dimension. But it was more accurate to say that this was just a painting of how difficult it was to step into the 8th dimension rather than a function of how difficult it was to become a life-grade crafter. It was simply impossible for a person to focus on both unless you were on the level of Cynthia and Velasco, or had many, many years of experience like the Omen and Morales ancestors. And yet, here was an absolute genius with the strength of a 7th-dimensional existence at the 6th dimension who had already crossed this threshold. In fact, it seemed that he had crossed it long ago, so much so that he could create 1,000,000 of them right before their eyes. Cynthia gripped the railing of the Omen family flagship. Her pupils couldn't seem to stop trembling even when she tried to stabilize herself. She had realized something from the beginning that everyone else was only now realizing. This stingrays. Lionel had no way of knowing they would be the oceanic beast he would receive. He hadn't even known what reward his subordinates would be able to bring back ahead of time. That meant that Lionel had casually drawn up a blueprint for a life-grade treasure in a few minutes before executing it right before all of their eyes. Blueprinting was a process that should have taken years alone. Cynthia had spent an entire decade on the blueprint she was most proud of. She hadn't even gotten around to crafting it yet. The essence of the life grade made the blueprint more important than almost the entire rest of the process. To be in the life grade only meant that you had created at least one blueprint of that level and had succeeded in crafting it. Many of the not even 500 life grade crafters in existence in the human domain only had 1 or 2 life grade blueprints to their name, and they were greatly praised for it. These 1 or 2 blueprints would be entirely unique to these crafters, and often powerful families and experts would be exorbitant prices just to have one of these unique treasures under their possession. There was a very good reason why the White Lion Bao was such a big deal despite only having been at the quasi-life grade for most of its life until recently. Life grade treasures were impossible rare, so impossibly rare that it was difficult to put into words. The best of the life grade crafters had 1 or 2 dozen blueprints under their wings, including Cynthia. Only Ancestor Hito of the Morales and the oldest Omen were speculated to have hundreds, maybe even thousands of such blueprints. However, there was a vast difference between having thousands of such blueprints, and casually creating one after a few minutes of thought. Of course, there was also a difference between creating life-grade crafts using 6th-dimensional materials and 8th-dimensional materials like the ones Cynthia and the other crafters of her level used. But Cynthia wasn't a fool. The gate of the life grade had little to do with dimension, that was something only laymen believed. Fundamentally, a life grade crafter, regardless of the base materials used, was still the life grade. It was several orders of magnitude more valuable than the basic materials used. The more Cynthia thought about it, the harder she squeezed. This was the first time she had been so agitated. Even Lionel's combat strength hadn't done this. Not his Scarlet Star Force, not his Void Star Force, not his Vital Star Force, not even his powerful Dream Force. The weight of a life-grade crafter who could do such things was too much. But what Cynthia didn't know was that the weight was about to become much, much heavier than she could have ever expected. Lionel's eyes snapped open, breathing heavily 3 times before his beating heart calmed. He had really pushed it this time, but the life grade was a very finicky realm to enter. If he had taken a break in the middle, minute changes could have occurred that would have caused him to have to recalculate all over again. That would only make his situation even worse and extend the time he needed to take. Lionel pushed his way out and stepped out of the pod. Judging by the skies above, he had managed to recover in just 45 minutes, this was good. There was no time to waste. With a wave of his hand, the skies were suddenly filled with armors, shimmering like sapphires and emeralds. The ground shook and Lionel took a leap to the city walls. The armors shot down under his control, slipping onto the bodies of the stingrays below. The sound of clicking resounded before the blue waters suddenly began to glow. Suddenly, the stingrays seemed to naturally be formed into groups, a radiant aura coming from them. Lionel checked a new spatial ring that had appeared on his hand and nodded to himself. In the 3 days he had been focused on crafting, the others had already succeeded in finding what he needed. Without hesitation, Lionel executed several actions in a row, upgrading his cities to the gold grade one after another and then fusing them. The sea began to churn wildly. In another insane feat, Lionel had activated the air grade upgrade challenge without even waiting for the others to return. Chapter 2013. Published at 20th of July 2023 5:45 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 2013. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2013. Monster. With a flip of his palm, Lionel's black rod appeared. His hair whipped in the salty winds as the high sun pierced downward, illuminating everything. The waters turned frothy and agitated, but the cool air of the ice island he now stood upon left him feeling calm and unhurried. A confident aura exuded from Lionel, his momentum steadily growing with each passing second. In the distance, the waters began to rise. 300 large whale beasts appeared, surrounding the ice island entirely. Around them, millions of oceanic beasts began to appear. The numbers were so numerous that the waters turned black, a sharp contrast from the previous clarity. However, Lionel remained calm. The spectators could only remain silent. Were the life grade armors really enough? No one underestimated the worth of the life grade, but the problem was that they were so rare that many didn't even have a reference for how powerful they should be. Most would kill to get their hands on even a top-tier gold-grade weapon, and this was all the reference they had. But was it enough to close a gap of 1 to 300? It was hard to believe, especially when the air-grade generals began to appear. They looked to be even about 10% stronger than air-grade threats that Lionel had fought previously. Each one was menacing to an extreme and seemed to have the strength to lay waste to Lionel's city. But at that moment, Lionel, who had everyone's focus, suddenly sneered. He raised his free hand and snapped his fingers. Right then, the world turned entirely silent. On the front line, a group of 10 stingrays suddenly trembled. They felt their backs grow hot as a powerful force art suddenly activated, but the chilly waters immediately cooled them down. A slight sheen of bluish-green formed on their bodies until they suddenly explosively expanded, forming a gorgeous, shimmering bubble. Then, these 10 bubbles, one to each stingray, came into contact with one another and overlapped, fusing into one and forming a large bubble that enveloped all 10 of them. Just when it seemed like it was all finished, the large bubble morphed, flattening out and gaining sharper edges and a long protrusion until it formed the construct of an enormous illusory stingray that contained 10 stingrays within. Even the smallest stingray was about 20 meters from wingtip to wingtip. But now, with this construct enveloping 10 of them, they seemed to have become larger than life, dwarfing 250 meters as they slowly swung their tails. In that instant, this process repeated, all at the same time, across the stingrays. At that moment, an army of what was once a million large stingrays had become an army of 100,000 enormous monstrosities, each causing vicious hurricane-like cyclones with just their small, insignificant movements. Lionel looked down as the challenge approached. He could almost feel the skepticism radiating from the observers. He had just limited the flexibility of the army he did have by a factor of 10, and the change didn't seem to be significant enough to cause any changes. What was the point of this? But Lionel's sneer only deepened. He didn't seem to have any intention of attacking himself. Kill. His words descended and the world suddenly changed. On the front line, the first line of stingray constructs suddenly jolted. The movement could only be described as a bolt of emerald green lightning. They left afterimages in the water, splitting it apart with such speed that a huge dividing line in the shape of an inverted V appeared on the surface. Fast. This was the only thought that those watching could have. So fast that it was crippling, so fast that it left only time for despair. The stingrays didn't even seem prepared for the level of speed they had now, so much so that they could do nothing but ram into the line of beasts they were facing. It was the kind of tactic that should have assured death. 100,000 running into a dense pack of over 300 million, how could it even compare? And yet, silence reigned. The stingray constructs shredded everything in their path. Their wings were as sharp as blades and their tails and menacing as jagged daggers with the soft touch of silk. Every time they moved, the water would churn and become their spearhead, shredding skin and blubber apart as though wet tissue paper. In a single charge each stingray had killed no less than 100 in a single sweep, and not a single one had been injured. The construct that enveloped them seemed to double for both defense and offense. Without the strength to tear it apart, harming the stingrays within was simply impossible. No matter how hard they tried, the mere gold-grade threats had no ability to cause more than a ripple on their surface, let alone shattering them apart. The air-grade constructs bellowed into the skies, but in response, Lionel just took a seat down on the city walls. He realized that he had underestimated even himself. It seemed that it wouldn't be necessary for him to raise a finger at all. Under the shocked gazes of the spectators, the first stingray construct, powered by a squadron of 10, made it to the first air-grade general. The two clashed, the stingray construct trembling wildly as the air-grade general was sent reeling backward, the howl of a whale echoing tragically as several cuts were carved out along its thick belly. The stingray's construct cracked and threatened to collapse, but that was when a second came in and rushed into the body of the air-grade general, shredding it to pieces. It was then that it finally seemed to settle in. Lionel hadn't gone from 1,000,000 gold-grade threats to just 100,000, he had gone from 1,000,000 gold-grade threats to 100,000 air-grade threats. The railing Cynthia was holding on to shattered, her fair palms bleeding as it was ravaged by cuts and scrapes. Lionel could only be described as a little monster. Chapter 2014. Published at 27th of July 2023 10:20 and 51 seconds AM. Chapter 2014. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2014. 2 options. Lionel pushed off the city walls, his body suddenly flickering and vanishing. His first-tier divine armor took shape, a blinding bronze aura emitting from him as the ocean's waves rose to his back. Suddenly, he swung down, the mighty wave responding in kind and slicing an air-grade general in half. Lionel's spear spun in his hands. In response, the surging waves spiraled into the air like a twisting tentacle. He took another step through the air and appeared above another air-grade general and thrust forward. The skies rumbled and the clouds split. The spiraling waves seemed to be controlled by Lionel's might, shimmering with a slight golden hue as it pierced forward along with his spear, tearing a gaping hole through the head of another whale beast. Everywhere Lionel passed, the ocean's waves roared after him. As though his movements alone were enough to elicit their action, they responded in kind. As he danced through the skies, they too danced, a deadly waltz of murderous storms and flickering spear force causing mass destruction everywhere they went. Just days ago, Lionel didn't have nearly this much skill with water force. And yet, before their eyes now, he seemed to have become a god of the seas, a Poseidon donned in armor and traversing the skies. Lionel swept his spear out 3 times, causing 3 spiraling tendrils of water to rise from the surface. His hips pivoted and his blade glided through the air. With one thrust, the tendrils ripped through the body of another beast, then another, then another. They followed Lionel like roaring flood dragons, droplets of water falling around them and reflecting the delicate gold of his spear force. It was a scene too beautiful for how deathly it was. Even the waters below were beginning to turn a fierce violet color, dyed thoroughly with the blood of creatures far too large for their own good. The Morales ancestors watched with a glow in their eyes. They had never seen the absolute domain used in this fashion, but it was truly a sight too gorgeous for words. With the absolute domain, Lionel's spear could appear wherever he wanted given a certain range. In fact, when the absolute spear domain grew enough in strength, even displacing it through time wasn't entirely impossible. But to use this ability to make use of the power of nature itself to strengthen yourself. This was a level of spearmanship that was rare beyond belief. This was even beyond what these ancestors could do. Their spear force was, obviously, much stronger than Lionel's. But when it came to comprehension of the spear, it felt like they were actually not just a single step behind. 10 stars erupted to Lionel's back and his divine armor shifted as he retrieved his first-tier armor and used his second-tier divine armor. His strength multiplied several times over. He unleashed a mighty roar, dragging his spear blade from a downward position and pulling it up in a wide arc toward the skies. A blinding crescent of golden spear force took shape, blasting forward and splitting everything in its path in 2. The ocean's waters parted, forming a trenching several kilometers deep. The boundaries of the trench's sides were so solid that beasts caught up in it began to fall. They slipped out the sides of the trench, crashing into the darkness below and churning the waters with flesh and blood. It was a complete massacre. What should have been the difficult air-grade upgrade challenge had become nothing more than a joke. In the 3 days that Lionel was busy, others had managed to catch up and form gold-grade territories of their own. But just as quickly as they were left behind again, and this time the gap was even larger than it had been previously. It might not be an entire week, potentially 2 for some, before these heirs even thought of challenging the air grade. But now, Lionel had claimed an entire sea for himself. Lionel stood in the skies, taking a deep breath. The dense smell of the ocean filled his nostrils and lungs, leaving him with an oddly peaceful expression, even though the human domain was anything but peaceful at the moment. Still, this had nothing to do with Lionel. With a flash, he appeared in the city lord manor, looking at his current territory. Lionel's heart skipped a beat. He already knew that he would have control over an entire sea, a fourth of the ocean after this, but he was stunned by just how expansive the territory truly was. Just taking into account the surface, it was about a quarter the size of a supercontinent. However, if you accounted for its depth, just in a small region of the ocean previously, Lionel had found 200 challenges and almost 50 dungeons, and that had been in just a 20-kilometer range. Now, however, Lionel controlled almost 2,000 kilometers of length and just over 500 kilometers of width. There were so many challenges and dungeons that it wasn't even realistic for him to clear them all in a short time. Lionel realized that this was likely another test. Now, he had to juggle the benefits of accumulation versus action. He had many resources at his fingertips, but there had to be a balance between gathering and taking part in these resources and spearheading his path toward ending these air wars and claiming victory for him. Lionel fell into thought for a moment. Seeing the sort of advantage claiming a C held, if there was one thing he had to do, it was to make sure that no one else could gain such an advantage. There were only two ways of doing this. The first was by finding anyone trying to expand into the ocean and taking them out before they could take more action, but this was unrealistic. Just his fourth of the ocean was so expansive, how would he find others in the 3/4 that remained? That only left the other method, to claim them before anyone else could. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Chapter 2015. Published at 27th of July 2023 10:21 and 49 seconds AM. Chapter 2015. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2015. Could it be? If he wanted to take this route, he would need three things. The first were more city upgrade passes, the second were more unique ocean territories, and the last were territory size upgrade rewards. The second was more important than the former. If it came down to it, he could just force upgrades on his own. After passing this air grade upgrade, he had more points than he even knew what to do with. Each gold grade threat was worth 10,000 points, and there had been 300 million of them. That meant that just from them, not even counting the 300 air grade generals, Lionel had 3 trillion points. Of course, not knowing what to spend his points on was a function of not having checked what he had access to now that he owned an air grade territory. Even if he had only passed a normal upgrade challenge, it would have still been at least 1 trillion points. Lionel doubted that Ancestor Hito would just provide enough points for it to be next to useless. Even so, if it came down to it, Lionel could afford several air grade upgrade challenges now if it came down to it, so the unique ocean territories that he could pair with unique territory size upgrade rewards were far more valuable to him. The first thing Lionel did after making his decision was to check through the rewards that the others had accumulated while he was crafting and after he had fallen asleep. Unfortunately, there were no other unique ocean territories in them, but there were many gold-grade city upgrade passes, 4 of them to be exact, and there was 1 territory size upgrade reward. It seemed that special territories were rarer than Lionel had originally thought, but then again, after the first few days, all of the air-grade dungeons had already been cleared, so the others had no choice but to focus on the other lower-grade dungeons. Now, however, it seems that we need to make another push. Lionel nodded to himself. The others should have already sensed the changes. Once they knew the locations of the other resources, claiming them would be exceptionally easy. As soon as they found a unique ocean territory reward, Lionel would be able to go about claiming a second sea as quickly as possible. As Lionel was lost in his thoughts, quickly planning out the next steps, the uproar of the human domain hadn't simmered down in the slightest, and that was because of only one thing, Lionel's crafts. This wasn't about the life grade anymore, it was rather about the value of Lionel's crafts. They were beyond a normal life grade treasure and this was plain as day for all to see. When it had settled in what Lionel's crafts could do, the entire human domain was shaken. This was for a very simple reason. The only organization that had a craft even close to this was Shield Cross Stars. However, even Shield Cross Stars was wholly inferior. That was Lionel's craft now, it felt like nothing more than a joke. Cross Elder Avon's expression was as ripe as a tomato. He, himself, because Lionel's could be used both offensively and defensively. At the same time, it could be used by 10 people simultaneously. In comparison, Shield Cross Star's craft could only be used defensively as it was a shield. To make matters worse, it could only be used by 3 people simultaneously, limiting its power. Despite how inferior it was, this unique craft of Shield Cross Stars had been a staple of their power for countless generations and the secret to its crafting was one of their top-tier secrets. There was no doubt that it was the subject of jealousy for many, but seeing Lionel's craft now, it felt like nothing more than a joke. Cross Elder Avon's expression was as ripe as a tomato. He, himself, didn't know anything about crafting, but he had enough life experience to understand what he was seeing. However, it was also because of his lack of perspective that he also believed that Lionel must have a method of forming this armor for humans as well. If this technology was in the hands of the Morales family who were already so powerful, just what would happen? This might restrict those with the metal synergy lineage factor, as they were already used to wearing their own divine armor into battle, but a large half of the Morales family only had the spear domain lineage factor and garbed themselves with normal armors. What if all the spear domain lineage factor Morales members were given armors like the ones Lionel had just given the Stingrays? Would it even be possible to defeat the Morales? The words of Lionel couldn't help but echo in their ears. They had felt that Lionel was far too reckless. Even if he was confident in striking down his peers, what about the retaliation of the powers behind them? Why was he so confident? Did he really believe that the Morales family was infallible? Everything Lionel did seemed to paint the picture that he was meticulous and scheming. He wasn't the type of person to make such foolish mistakes. But no matter how they racked their brains, they felt that he was far too reckless, until now. Lionel wasn't provoking them all, waiting to run behind the shadow of the Morales family and their protection. In fact, judging by his personality, he might very well be waiting for this war. In fact, he might even want this war. They shuddered when they reached this point in their thoughts, their blood running cold. Why did Lionel struggle so much against the gold grade upgrade challenge if he had such a trump card in hand? It seemed that he didn't even think about bringing it out until he really had no other options left, as though he was unwilling to display it unless he absolutely had to. Could it be that he had many such trump cards? Could it be that his vision was never set on the air wars to begin with because he had always felt that his victory was guaranteed? Could it be that, from the very beginning, he was only using these air wars among juniors to declare war on the entire human domain? Chapter 2016. Published at 27th of July 2023, 10:21 and 49 seconds AM. Chapter 2016. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2016. Enough. Ancestor Alvaro laughed uproariously. He laughed so hard that even the stars in the distance seemed to twinkle under the wild vibrations. He laughed so hard that he even began to cough and wheeze. Damn, I'm too old for this. Despite saying this, he couldn't stop laughing at all. He knew that this change only put more pressure on the Morales family, but the pressure had gone from all the powers of the human domain to all the powers of the human domain. This was the problem with putting all your cards on the table at once. How could they threaten them more than they already had? It was even amusing seeing their expression change like this. Ancestor Alvaro and the others were having the time of their lives. The best part was that Lionel had crafted it before them all, for a solid 3 days, repeating the same steps again and again and again, for a total of 1,000,000 times. And they still didn't understand what the hell was going on right before them. It was clear the gap between where Lionel was and where the rest of the human domain was so wide that it was unfathomable. To put this matter into perspective, more life-grade crafters would be so secretive with their blueprints that they wouldn't even allow others to see them. Even their own children weren't allowed such a privilege. While they were crafting, the entire region was locked down, and they would even often ask those who had commissioned for the treasure to bring far more materials than they would need just to keep the true materials list a secret. After such life-grade crafters passed on, it was only then that their crafts would be passed down to others in their family, but even then only the highest echelon would be able to lay their eyes on it, while the younger generation would have to provide a great deal of merits just for the sliver of a chance. Usually, unless you rose to the level of an ancestor, you could forget it. Even Cynthia, who was a great genius and could have benefited greatly from seeing a life-grade blueprint ahead of time while she was still in the gold grade, wasn't given such a privilege until she was well into the 7th dimension. Back then, she had already surpassed Tier 6, she wouldn't have even been allowed to participate in these air wars back then. If the human domain wasn't so strict with life-grade blueprints, there would probably be more life-grade crafters than just the few hundred there were, but this was just how things were, or more accurately, this was how the Force Crafting Guild had made things. Whether it was Force Crafting or Force Pill Crafting, both had the same issues, and both happened to be overseen by the Omen family. The Morales family had never needed the Omen family for Force Crafting, but their rules surrounding Force Pill Crafting had caused no small amount of issues. Luckily, the Morales family could absorb ores to strengthen themselves, and they were less reliant on Force Pills compared to other families. However, even so, only half of them had this benefit. It could only be said that the history of the Oman and Morales family was quite long and contentious, but what was important here was Lionel and his craft. Elder Avon might not understand, but how could these crafters not? Not only had Lionel forged a life-grade treasure as a sixth-dimensional junior, he had also begun to forge again on a force-crafting language they had simply never seen before, one so complex they couldn't even understand it. By this point, more than half of the best geniuses of the human domain had already been kicked out. Being forced to watch Lionel, the one who had threatened them all, shine like this, they could only grind their teeth. After the amethyst token drama of over 20 years ago, many of them had a faint recollection of Lionel in their minds. But after he didn't appear for so long, many thought he had died and didn't bother to care about him any longer. As for when he actually came back, they cared even less. How could they think that Lionel could bridge a gap of 20 years? They didn't even consider it, but then Lionel crushed Conan while he was still in the first tier. However, they then broke through to the seventh dimension and they felt that they had left him far behind once again, only to realize that that gap had never meant much to Lionel in the first place. The reality was slowly starting to sink in. If they hadn't been given an over 20-year head start, they wouldn't even have the right to stand on the same stage as him. The uproar of the human domain slowly faded into a solemn silence, the presence of a single young man looming tall and imposing. Lionel sensed a fragrant wind approaching and he turned to find that Aina had already appeared to his side. Without a word, he handed her yet another spatial ring. This one held the corpses of 300 air-grade generals. She looked within and her brows raised. It was a lovely sort of blaming expression that looked more cute than it did intimidating. Clearly, she was unhappy with Lionel for challenging the air-grade upgrade while they weren't even here. The other upgrades had been one matter, but this one was quite reckless. Lionel only smiled lightly, something that he had done rarely in recent days. "What's the ETA?" Aina asked. "I've decided to conquer and corner off the rest of the ocean first as a defensive play. We'll need more special ocean territories and territory expansion rewards. If things happen as fast as I want them to, we'll launch the final march to end this 1 week from now." It's enough time," Aina said lightly. Lionel nodded and Aina flickered and vanished. Chapter 2017. Published at 27th of July 2023 10:21 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 2017. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2017. Immediately before Lionel set out again, he paid keen attention to the changes in his abilities as the new owner of an air-grade territory. Many things were pretty standard. For example, there were upgraded outposts, and there were also some defensive measures unique to air-grade territories. Right now, the walls Lionel had access to were already quite fantastic. They were 100 meters tall and over 10 meters thick. On top of that, they were forged of a powerful metal alloy. However, other than that, they were relatively simple. Many of the options included infusing it with certain large-scale force arts that could greatly strengthen it. There were also methods of banning flight within a certain range of the city. The more he paid, the larger the range would be. What was more interesting to Lionel, though, were the unique upgrades he could gain since he had a special ocean territory. Many of these things, unsurprisingly, were related to ice. The most intriguing of them was what was called cold force. Lionel didn't think that such a force actually existed, but it must have been created for the air wars quite specifically. It was a force that could be emitted from his island and act like a domain that covered the city. Those that entered this domain would feel as though their own force was icing over. Their blood would flow slower and their bodies would become stiff. Depending on how stronger the overstrength of the targets were, one could lose anywhere between 10% to even all of their combat prowess. Would work with 100 meters of his walls, it would cost him over $1 trillion. The maximum setting, that would work for an entire 10. The price, though, was quite steep. Just for the lowest setting that would work with 100 meters of his walls, it would cost him over $1 trillion. The maximum setting, that would work for an entire 10 kilometers, cost 10 times that. That maximum setting cost 3 times more than what Lionel had. Seeing that the first thing he wanted was actually so expensive, Lionel held off on buying it immediately. That was because he knew that if one thing was actually so expensive, then most other things would be as well. After a moment, and scanning through all available rewards, Lionel realized that these outrageous prices were unique to, ironically, the unique territory rewards of his city. But it was also because of this that they were likely to be the most useful. The Cold Force domain was a game changer. Anyone believed the gold grade threat level would be incapacitated and no different from fish on a chopping block within its range. Those on the weaker side of the gold grade would lose as much as half of their combat strength, while those who were the strongest would lose at least a tenth. Only air-grade threats would be capable of entirely ignoring it. At the strongest setting, costing over 10 trillion, even an air-grade threat would have a 10% reduction in their strength within a 10-kilometer range. Another unique reward was the ice moat. Lionel felt that a better name for this reward would be the ice maze. That was because it formed a maze of ice in the water that could hinder the advancement of oceanic beasts. The walls of this maze would be incredibly sturdy, comparable to about half that of the base city walls. Simply put, no single creature would be able to take down even a single wall without many hours of effort. The best part about the ice moat wasn't its defenses, but rather the fact that it forced the oceanic beasts swimming below to split up, disallowing them the ability to gang up and use their potentially overwhelming numbers. It functioned essentially like a funnel, forcing the oceanic beasts to fight alone. The ice moat would also be quite useful in case anyone came to attack Lionel with boats and the like. Although it was an underwater design, it still peeked out of the water over 3 meters or so. Unless a ship wanted to destroy its hull in a battering ram attempt, they would likewise had no choice but to follow the path of the maze. Of course, the best part was that running into a dead end wasn't impossible. At that point, you would only have two options: to turn back or to take the effort in attempting to knock down the wall. But if you chose the second option, you might run into yet another dead end on the other side. Both of these rewards were incredibly intriguing, but the ice moat was even more expensive. Just its most basic level cost 2 trillion more than what Lionel had. The good news was that it could cover an entire kilometer instantly, but the bad news was, obviously, that he couldn't afford it. The last unique reward that had caught Lionel's attention was a unique territory protector. It was, of course, of the air grade, but it was exceptionally powerful. This protector took the form of a star of ice. When activated, in exchange for 1 billion points, it could trigger an area of effect attack that worked like a rain of ice meteors. These ice meteors froze water on contact and had great blunt force damage. The lowest setting could target a 100-meter region. The highest setting could attack all around the city, though it was still limited to 100 meters. There was clearly a difference between one 100-meter region and the entire 100-meter radius around the city walls. Unsurprisingly, this was the most expensive of them all at 10 trillion just for the lowest setting and close to 100 trillion for the highest. Lionel faced a situation where he had to choose whether he would save up or not. With his army of stingrays, he could take on the air grade upgrade with quite some ease and guarantee himself anywhere from 1 trillion to 3 depending. He already planned to do this 3 more times, so if he was patient, by the end of it, he would be able to afford the Star of Ice. However, Lionel shook his head. Sometimes, sitting on a pile of cash was worse than spending it. Even if you didn't do anything and were frugal, as time passed, your money would only become worth less and less. That was the way of the world and of inflation. Thinking to this point, Lionel bought the lowest setting of the Cold Force domain immediately. Chapter 2018. Published at 27th of July 2023 10:21 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 2018. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2018. An alliance with the remaining more than 2 trillion. Lionel upgrade the domain to the greatest setting her could, gaining over a kilometer in range and quite a bit in strength. After this, he decisively left, his body vanishing. When he appeared again through a teleportation platform, he was within the territory he had left to Maya to manage. As expected of the cloud race, from the outside, it was simply impossible to tell that there was something wrong at all. They all moved and acted just like the Tor family would have, something that left the ancestors of the Constellation family quite enraged. but there was little to nothing that they could do about it. After handing Maya a spatial ring, Lionel vanished once again and returned to his main territory. It had already been over 3 days since his last report from the Umbra family, but just as he had asked of them, they returned quite frequently to give him reports. The more Lionel learned of the situation, the more certain he was that someone, most likely Second Nova, was stirring up a great deal of conflict. The first instance was Sixth Nova falling seemingly without warning. This left a vast and open territory that everyone immediately took advantage of. However, because Third Nova had been preoccupied with expelling Fourth Nova, he missed the boat, resulting in him falling behind the others. This felt like a coincidence on the surface, but Lionel was quite certain that this coincidence was actually a perfectly timed scheme with excellent execution. It was just unfortunate that Sixth Nova had to be the one to suffer. With Fifth Nova, Sixth Nova and Fourth Nova all gone and dealt with, there were only 4 heirs of the Morales family remaining, and only 3 of which, including Lionel, who had any real territory. As expected, Third Nova wasn't very happy about this change at all. It felt like his lead was being swallowed up, so he couldn't remain idle for long. Not long after that moment, he became the first to enter the gold grade, and while the others were scrambling to lock down and ensure others couldn't snatch their new territory, he swallowed up all of Fourth Nova's old territory for him. Due to this, Third Nova was able to make up for his slight slip and he began making a big push toward the air grade. However, this was when the details of an explosive battle was relayed, and surprisingly, this time it had little to do with Morales family. For some reason, this huge clash came between the Suyard family and the spiritual faith. Lionel couldn't help but narrow his gaze when he read about this information. That was because he was still wondering about what danger Third Nova possessed and whether or not he truly had a connection with the Suyard family or not. Obviously, Lionel felt that observing the Suyard family was one of the best ways to gain an understanding of what might be going on. For the Suyard family, who had mostly remained silent since the start of these air wars, to suddenly get into a conflict with yet another power that hadn't done much since the start of the air wars, felt off. It was almost like they were putting on a play for others. But it was also because it was so obvious and blatant that Lionel felt that it was a bit ridiculous on its face. If they wanted to scheme, shouldn't they come up with a more clever method? The spiritual faith was probably a thorn at the side of many of the most powerful powers of the human domain. How could the likes of Shield Cross Stars and the Void Palace be okay with a religion that so blatantly worshipped another race? In truth, the spiritual race was so powerful that they very rarely took the initiative to attack anyone. Even if the human domain faced danger from other races in the future, the odds that this threat would come from the spiritual race was minimal. Even so, no one had to think to answer what the spiritual faith would do if the day came that the spirituals did have such ill intentions. Just like that, one of the most powerful forces of the human domain would defect without a second thought. The Zoltene faith was similar as they worshipped the nomad race. Lionel had already personally been to one of their shrines. These people had little regard for the human race despite being human themselves. Lionel felt that there was a secret to this matter. Despite the fact he had improved so much and seen so much of the human domain by now, he had still yet to meet one of these so-called gods. The evergreen goddess, the Zoltene god, the spiritual's god, he had always thought that they were real people. His father's dictionary had made it clear that this was the case. So where were they? How could such individuals not participate in something that had captured the attention of the entire human domain? These thoughts had always been swirling around in the back of Lionel's mind, which was why when he heard about this battle that made little to no sense, his antennas were immediately placed in an upward position. However, what baffled Lionel even more was the truth behind all of this. After a lot of scouting, and even the use of many strategically placed Cloud race members, Radless came back with information that left Lionel speechless. It turned out that Amory, the so-called sword deity, was betrothed to the heir of the spiritual's faith. Or, more accurately, the future Lady Pontiff of the faith. For whatever reason, both parties were quite opposed to this marriage and they could only be described to be at loggerheads. This dislike of one another reached the point that they even fought on this sort of stage. However, after a battle that lasted the better part of a day and spread like wildfire, it settled down without a victor, and there were even clear signs of both parties freely entering and exiting their adjacent territories. Even without it being described in so many words, the conclusion was obvious: an alliance. Chapter 2019. Published at 27th of July 2023, 10:22 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 2019. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2019 only. Lionel didn't even frown at this realization, his expression indifferent. He always moved with the worst-case scenario in mind. He already imagined that these air wars would end with him facing off against many enemies at once. Whether they teamed up now or later made no difference to him. What he cared about more were the implications. It seemed that the spirituals were uncaring about most of what happened in the universe. This was something he had become greatly aware of after reading the records of the Void Palace. There were many instances of other races attacking the human domain through the Void battlefield, but none of the spiritual race doing so. Even if a family had an alliance with the spiritual faith, it wouldn't be seen as a red flag to most. One also had to consider the stance the human domain had toward other races as well. Compared to the greater universe, the human domain was fairly lax with other races. Or, at the very least, there was no systematic movement to get rid of them. The Oryx could thrive just fine while the likes of Yuri were even allowed to enter the Void Palace. This made it clear that the human domain didn't usually act against other races. However, the problem of Third Nova was making Lionel second and third guess this matter. Another interesting matter also happened to be the Suyard family's lineage factor. Much like the Morales family, the Suyard family had two lineage factors, not one like most other families. This was why they were seen to be on par with the Morales. They had the strength to back up such thoughts. The Suyard family had the sword domain lineage as well as the blazing devil lineage factor. Oddly enough, Lionel felt that the Suyard family was quite a bit like the Morales in this regard as well. Their lineage factor was very demon-like, maybe even more so than the Morales. Lionel could still remember how Amory's eyes had reddened that day the second time they fought. In the end, he was forced to suppress himself so that his tribulation didn't erupt ahead of time. From Lionel's understanding, their lineage factor similarly strengthened their bodies. Aside from that, it gave them great affinity with Dark Force in addition to having several other auxiliary benefits that wouldn't have been listed in the Void Library. These would account for techniques similar to Metal Body and Divine Armor. Lionel would have no way of knowing the true details until he forced them out of Amory, then there would likely also be his ability index to deal with. Whether it was the first or second encounter they had had, Lionel knew that he had never fought Amory's best. The first time he had been suppressed by the Vital Star Force, and the second time he had been suppressed by his tribulation. Regardless of how you looked at it, he would be a powerful opponent, and unlike with Nazag, Lionel couldn't directly strip away one of his strongest abilities. However, also unlike Nazag, Lionel had a great will to crush Amory in the worst way possible. At that moment, Lionel suddenly thought of something and his gaze narrowed. He sent a message to Radlease after a while and threw the thought to the back of his mind as he continued through the events. After the Suyard and spiritual faith clearly allied, they once again fell into dormancy, doing nothing much more. However, not long after that, First Nova and Third Nova had their first clash. This clash occurred in the open waters, but for an unknown reason, it didn't continue to a point of no return and they both retreated without any results. Of course, this was actually a clash between Vega and some of Third Nova's subordinates rather than First and Third Nova themselves. But Radlease had still added this to the report as Lionel had asked for everything of significance. Following this, Third Nova clashed with the Ram family. However, just when it seemed that he would claim victory, he suddenly retreated, rushing back to his territory to find that his city walls had fallen. Lionel felt that, once again, Second Nova had struck. But what he didn't know was how Second Nova had managed to do this without detection to a gold-grade territory. He could only speculate that Second Nova had taken some time to clear dungeons and claimed a gold-grade version of the silver-grade wall, destroying rewards he had previously gained. There was no easy way to rebuild the walls after they had been destroyed. The only methods were to rebuild it by hand, to find a reward that could replace them, or to undergo an upgrade challenge. But taking on the air grade challenge without walls was nothing short of suicidal. Third Nova was thwarted again and he seemed to be in a bad situation. After investing so much into a gold grade territory, he couldn't just abandon it. And he had yet to gather enough points to take on the air grade challenge even if he wanted to take the risk. Without a choice, Third Nova could only set aside his ideas of conquest and began to accumulate. He dispersed his subordinates with the goal of claiming and clearing as many challenges and dungeons as was possible. When Lionel got to this point, his eyes narrowed. As expected, there was a clash. No, more accurately, there was a speculated clash. The Umbra family didn't manage to get eyes on it, all they could do was speculate. Lionel's heart skipped a beat. To him, it was obvious. Second Nova had diverted Third Nova's attention, giving him no choice but to spread out his army and give up his greatest advantage, numbers. Then, Kira and Second Nova could take Third Nova on without the disadvantage. However, out in Morales family's flagship, the sound of a crying woman echoed. Kira's tears fell like a torrential storm, holding Oren who was continuously coughing up black blood. Ancestor Hito opened his eyes and frowned, an expression that even the ancestors of the Morales had never seen from him. He's been poisoned. I have no method of dispelling it, this is only something that the Omen family can cure. Chapter 2020. Published at 27th of July 2023 10:22 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 2020. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2020. Poison. Not many had seen the battle between Third Nova and Second Nova. It could even be said that the latter had wanted it this way. He attacked right when it seemed that Third Nova was about to enter a state of slow expansion. After watching the air wars for many days already, the novelty had worn off and many were entirely focused on whichever region had the most action. As such, quite a few had no idea who had even injured Second Nova to begin with, even the Morales ancestors were quite clueless. Since poison was used, the immediate assumption was the Pious family, and Oren and Kira did nothing to refute this. For whatever reason, they didn't want to describe what had happened and maybe that was always the plan. Despite Kira's crying, Oren couldn't seem to hear or feel anything but a spine-tingling pain. He looked up toward the starry skies, his lips pressed into a line. Maybe he had never thought that things would end like this. Ancestor Hito was indeed correct. Maybe only the Omen family would have a method of dealing with this. While the Pious family worked with poisons, their methods weren't conventional. As they relied on their unique force and its manipulation, they didn't concoct poisons and create antidotes like many other poison masters. Instead of this, they trained their poison force to be able to do the work of creation and immunity itself. The trouble with this approach, though, was that while Pious family members could purge themselves and one another from poison, it was impossible for them to use this method on others. Trying to use poison force on someone without poison force affinity to dispel poison was like pouring oil onto an already burning fire. Even if the Pious family had been the ones to poison Oren, their help was next to useless in this regard. The only one that could help would be the Omen family and their force pill crafters. The Omen family was the only family with the skill to dispel such a high-level poison. In fact, they would probably need one of their best gold-grade force pill crafters to do the job as well. A normal force pill crafter would have no chance. That was Ancestor Hito's observation and they understood it intimately. Kira wanted to immediately get up and beg the Omen family if she had to, but before she could even stand to her feet, she felt a strong grip on her wrist, a grip firmer than anything Oren should have been able to muster given his current state, and yet he had found the strength. The Morales family doesn't know weakness. Oren continued to stare into the skies, his expression blank and his lips once again pressing into a thin line. His grip on Kira's wrist didn't weaken, and it even seemed to tighten as time went on. It was as though he knew that he was growing weaker, so he tried his best to compensate. Kira writhed and struggled. "I'm not a Morales. Let me go." However, Oren didn't seem to hear her, his eyes slowly closing. He took deep and steady breaths, breath steadier than anyone would have expected of him at this moment. He seemed to be at peace, his vice grip holding onto Kira firmly. A Salvatine doesn't show weakness either. The words entered Kira's ears and she shuddered, her tears falling even faster. The Morales ancestors watched with dark expressions. Oren had already made his stance quite clear. They would only be slapping his face if they asked for help now. They didn't know how long Oren would last for, but it likely wouldn't be very much time. Any poison with such potent effects couldn't possibly take too long to deal with a seventh-dimensional existence. Who did this to you? Ancestor Alvaro asked, his gaze red with fury. He didn't look toward the Omen family even once. He knew if he did he would lose himself to rage and begin this war even before the Air Wars ended. In the history of the Air Wars, no Morales had ever died, not since their no-killing rule had been established. It was an event that was supposed to promote harmony and healthy competition, not bloodshed. It was these people who had forced this event to be this way. It was they who had demanded bloodshed. It was they who wanted to enter for a chance to take Lionel's head. It was they who wanted to knock the Morales down a peg, they who let their greed guide their judgment. He could imagine their snide sneers and upturned noses. They might very well have a force pill that could save Oren's life right this moment in any one of their rings, but they would never step forward to give it over. Just thinking about it infuriated Ancestor Alvaro to the point he enough to infuriate the Morales ancestors beyond compare. They should have had 7 shining beacons into the future, but now it trembled. This was one of their best generations yet. Just the loss of one was enough to infuriate the Morales ancestors beyond compare. They should have had 7 shining beacons into the future, but now it seemed that one would lose his life here. It doesn't matter. Oren said lightly, his eyes still closed. It will be up to First Nova and Littlest Nova now. To the side, Sixth Nova's expression flickered with a complicated light. He had, indeed, been eliminated by Oren, but he didn't hold a grudge, it just meant that he was inferior. He gripped his fists tight. The only thing he regretted was not still being inside to deal with who had placed Second Nova in this state. The gazes of the Morales family members all turned red one after another, the space around their fists creaking and trembling. Their fury was stifling, a different sort of silence falling entirely. It seemed that they couldn't wait to unleash their fury. The stars in the distance turned crimson and space itself quaked. This time, the Morales family was truly infuriated. Chapter 2021. Published at 27th of July 2023 10:22 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 2021. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2021. Lost. Oren lost, Lionel said lightly. It was hard to believe. The strength that Oren had displayed before him, albeit just a small amount, was substantial. Just to counter him and Kira, Lionel not only had to use his second-tier armor, he also had to actively use his ability index in battle for the first time in a while. Ever since Lionel left the Tribulation Zone, whether subconsciously or not, he had stopped relying on his ability index in battle. The speed of improvement he had made in the way of the spear during his time in the Tribulation Zone spoke for itself. He would just be too stubborn if he chose to ignore the evidence right before him. Over time, he was slowly finding a balance between relying on his intelligence and his innate talent to slowly move forward and improve. However, it wasn't an easy balance to find. The last time he had had a breakthrough in this regard was during his battle with Miguel. This was all to say that Oren was the first person since he exited the Tribulation Zone and had such a big boost in his power that had actually made Lionel go so far. He had used not only all 10 of his star, he had used his 5th-dimensional life-grade divine armor and his ability index. These 3 things should have practically made Lionel undefeatable within the younger generation, but he could tell that both Oren and Kira had held back a great deal. So how had they lost to Third Nova anyway? There were only 2 explanations. Each was dangerous for its own reasons. The first was the most obvious, and that was that Third Nova was simply that strong. Even after dispersing his subordinates, he still had enough strength remaining to take on both Kira and Oren without a problem. In this case, the problem was obvious. He was far too powerful, maybe more powerful than Lionel could fathom. If the battle had ended quickly enough that others, and even the Umbra family, couldn't find out the details about it, this was a testament to how large the gap between third nova and second nova had been. The second was that third nova had been prepared for Oren and only pretended to disperse his people while keeping his strongest subordinates by his side. Maybe he had even laid a trap just for Oren to fall into it. The problem with this case was that third nova was incredibly scheming and intelligent. It implied that after Oren's 2 attempts at thwarting him, he had already seen through the fact that someone was targeting him and took appropriate precautions. He was ready for second nova's appearance from the very beginning. This was shocking because Lionel had seen Oren's level of caution firsthand. In fact, now that Lionel thought about it, Oren's methods of weakening third nova in the beginning seemed to smell of his lack of assurance in victory. It might have made sense for Oren to try and disperse Zavnik's people, but what was the purpose of clearing 6th nova's territory? One could argue that was to force Zavnik into a more desperate situation, which eventually led to the outcome Oren wanted, but Lionel wasn't so sure about that. He felt that Oren had felt that he was going to lose. But none of Oren's actions seemed to line up. Why did he keep this a secret? Did he inform the elders ahead of time? If he did, why did the Morales allow Zavnik to participate? Wouldn't it have been better to deal with him directly? Lionel didn't believe that the Morales were the type of family to get tied up in tradition and red tape. They would definitely ignore their own rules if they had a good enough reason to do so. It all seemed to circle back to the same point, the only reason Oren was acting in secrecy all this time to begin with. His demon origins. How is it connected? Lionel was in the middle of a battle with an air grade while trying to digest this information suddenly came to a complete stop. He was even swallowed whole by the air grade beast, but he made no attempt to stop it, his body frozen in place. Suddenly, the air grade threat was shredded to pieces from the inside out. Lionel appeared in the depths of the ocean, his absolutely domain raging around him. Lionel suddenly took a step, his speed blazing as he shot out of the ocean like a jet, quickly making his way back to his city. He had just received news that the others had finally found another unique territory. It was time to action. At the same time, Lionel's gaze couldn't help but grow with a fiendish light. Why would Oren keep all of this a secret? The only real explanation seemed to be that exposing third nova would likewise assumed. There was very likely a shadow faction within the Morales that was more aware of this than others. Expose himself. If Lionel was correct, not only was the Morales family's ties to the demon race much deeper than he had originally assumed, there was very likely a shadow faction within the Morales that was more aware of this than others. There was a very obvious clue here. In order for Oren to be born, a Morales had to mingle with the demon race enough to, maybe not necessarily fall in love, but to at least copulate and have a child. This wasn't a small instance of interaction at all. In the best-case scenario, the Morales had ties to the demon race in small, benign increments. In the worst-case scenario, the Morales family had always had the roots of the three-finger cult within it. In fact, these roots were so deep that if someone like Zavnik managed to become the heir, it would be enough to shift the tides in the family so much so that those that had once been in the shadows could see the light of day once more. Lionel suddenly understood that he wasn't the only one using these air wars as a stepping stone towards something much larger. A flicker of crimson danced within Lionel's eyes. Okay, Zavnik. Let's play. Bang! Lionel landed and the entire ice island boomed and quaked, threatening to shatter to pieces beneath his might. Important announcement below. Chapter 2022. Published at 7th of August 2023 1:22 and 42 seconds p.m. Chapter 2022. Water Lotus. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel appeared in his ice island city, his attention immediately turning to James, who tossed over a glass orb to him. When Lionel saw what was in it, his expression flickered for a moment. He had already guessed that the unique ocean territories wouldn't all be exactly the same, but this one was actually quite different. Of course, the name uniquely spoke for itself, but its unique attributes changed Lionel's plans a bit. At the very least, he couldn't be in as much ease as he had hoped. The unique ocean territory this time was probably more accurately called a unique water territory instead. If this was called an ice island territory, then this unique water territory would be quite accurately called a water lotus territory. Rather than forming a huge island of ice, it formed a huge island in the form of a blooming lotus. This didn't seem like a big deal, until you understood that a water lotus was a freshwater plant. While it can handle slightly salty water, specifically brackish water, which is a combination of river waters and ocean water, it wouldn't be able to live in a full-on salt body of water. In line with this water lotus territory would turn the surrounding territory into a freshwater body. The surrounding 10% of territory would become pure fresh water, while the remaining 90% would be brackish. This was actually good, if this had been Lionel's only territory. This was because there was a permanent debuff to oceanic creatures who entered this territory's waters. Within the brackish water, they would experience a 20% reduction to their strength. In the freshwater, they would lose as much as 50% of their strength. Of course, this scaled with the city's grade. A gold grade city could limit the strength of up to the gold grade, while an air grade city would be able to infect even air grade threats. However, there was a very obvious problem here. This chapter upload first at NWSB, C0M. Lionel's army of stingrays were saltwater creatures. As a result, they were subject to the very same debuff. This was the obvious downside of this city. There were no freshwater creatures in the region to begin with, this was the ocean. And unless you bought freshwater creatures from the water lotus city itself, you would be out of luck. There were fresh bodies of water on the supercontinents, but Lionel didn't have the time to divert his attention to them in an attempt to find freshwater creatures on a large enough scale for them to be useful. And there was obviously the largest problem. Lionel didn't have the time to spare to make another huge batch of armors. Lionel took a breath and exhaled, his gaze frighteningly calm. It wasn't impossible to find freshwater creatures. He owned the entire supercontinent and thus had a method of scanning the entire territory for what he needed. The issue was that doing so was useless for the reason of time. Anyone else would be ecstatic to receive such a territory, but Lionel's own skill had ironically painted him into a corner. This situation wasn't as bad as it seemed. After all, these debuffs would be suffered by the creatures of the upgrade challenge as well. That meant his stingrays and the enemy would be on the same playing field. But the larger problem would be if Lionel was ever attacked. There was no telling if others had access to freshwater creatures or not, or maybe even creatures who could exist in both. How pathetic would it be if he was suddenly at a disadvantage in his own territory? I think you should take a look at the other problem was that because this territory came with such a large advantage right from the outset, the benefits one could get afterward was limited. Lionel tossed the territory reward up and caught it again, his mind spinning with several thoughts. Seems that it's time to reveal another trump card. Call the commanders of the Skies family here. It wasn't long before a long line of Skies family members stood before Lionel. All of them had on extremely respectful expressions, which was a far cry from how things had been just a month or so ago. They were the only group Lionel had never sent out on missions, so everything Lionel had done, they had personally witnessed. The kind of strength Lionel could display at such a young age left them in complete awe. All of them were less than 100 years old and were relatively young as a result. Seeing the difference between them let them understand why it was their patriarch had lowered his head. It's about time, you all prepare yourselves. Lionel waved a hand. Exchanging several million points, he brought out over 100 spatial rings. The generals of the Skies family that he had appointed already knew what these rings were for. So, without a word, they immediately turned and left, rushing to get into place one after another. Lionel turned back to the others. For the next half day, stay outside this range of waters. After issuing his orders, Lionel flashed and vanished. With great speed, he found the location of waters he wanted and threw the water lotus orb out. It immediately burst from its glass orb and expanded wildly, surging out in all directions until it formed an enormous lotus. Large and thick green pads extended from the sides, while in the center, a gorgeous pink flower bloomed, its thin petals gently waving in the wind. For extra defense, the green pads could close, though it took a few hours to finish. So this had to be done well in advance. It could be said, though, that this territory was designed to be purely defensive. If he wanted it to be a death trap, it would be up to him. One after another, over the horizon, the Sky's family members dashed across the water's surface, swiftly catching up with Lionel. Lionel's gaze sharpened as he sent forward several more rewards, triggering the bronze upgrade challenge and then the silver and gold upgrade challenges right afterward. Chapter 2023. Published at 7th of August 2023 1:22 and 41 seconds p.m. Chapter 2023, Crack. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel dispersed the challenges with instant clear reward. His gaze narrowed as the Sky's family took up their position on the large grid pads. The current Sky's family members didn't look anything like they had before. There were still only about 10,000 of them, but since the beginning of the Air Wars, they had been wearing the very same simple linen clothing. But now, each one of them wore radiant armor, their foreheads fitted with a tight headband that seemed reminiscent of a simple crown. The drama on the night side supercontinent was so great at the moment that many were still focusing on what was happening there, especially since Lionel had entered a bit of a lull since clearing his first section of the sea. But suddenly seeing that he had gained another special territory, the expressions of many couldn't help but become serious. If Lionel succeeded, wouldn't this mean that he would claim half of the ocean for himself? Combining this with an entire supercontinent, wasn't this far too much? Many saw the clear problem with this strategy, though. Lionel already had a shortage of people. What good was it to have this much territory? He should be attacking the others before they could gather any more people. This was his best chance. There was only one explanation for this. Lionel wanted to prevent others from benefiting from the ocean. It was ambitious, more than they understood. Lionel's every action always seemed filled with so much confidence. It was clear that he did nothing by half measures. He was ambitious when he needed to be. He drew back when caution was needed. He schemed better than most they had seen, and the sharpness of his mind seemed to be on another level. Subconsciously, many realized that even when they couldn't explain why Lionel was doing something, they subconsciously believed that he had a good reason for doing so. This was a subtle, and yet prominent change occurring all across the human domain. Lionel couldn't be sure of the mind of others, but he had clearly planned on this kind of change. There was a reason he hadn't just started the domain war, and momentum was only part of the reason. He was far too unknown. Most knew his father but not him. He wanted to show this human domain that his own merits were enough to crush them. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M. Lionel's gaze suddenly blazed to life as he fused 2 more gold-grade city cores into the Water Lotus City. Without hesitation, he shot into the air, overlooking the waters. They had become much clearer, the smell of fresh water filling the air. It was intoxicating and filled one with a sense and calm. They were so clear that one could almost see to the bottom of the ocean despite its ridiculous depth. It was an absolutely gorgeous sight. But as soon as it appeared, it vanished beneath the wildly churning waters. At that moment, the members of the Sky's family all roared out at once. The clear skies above began to roll as a dense body of dark clouds began to make their way over. Their armors began to glow fiercely, strong pillars of gold light filled with lightning runes rising up and piercing the thick cumulonimbus clouds. Lionel watched this silently, unmoved by the churning lightning just above his head. The reality was that saltwater conducted lightning with far greater ease than freshwater. One would think that if Lionel wanted to use the Sky's family, he should have used them during his first air grade upgrade challenge instead of now. But this was actually the wrong way to view things, albeit an easy mistake to make. Lightning always chooses the path of least resistance. That meant that if one was in water that conducted it with greater ease, your odds of surviving wouldn't be lesser, it would actually be much greater. What did this mean? Simply put, the damage that could be done in freshwater was far beyond that of what could be done in saltwater, and that was because it was more difficult for lightning to pass through freshwater, and as such the odds it would choose to pass through your body instead was far higher. The moment Lionel saw that the surrounding and immediate 10% of his Water Lotus territory would become purely freshwater, it clicked into place for him and he realized that this was the absolute best time to use the Sky's family. I think you should take a look at, of course. Things weren't so simple as they seemed on the surface. "Kill," Lionel said lightly. The gazes of the sky's family members flashed, their pillars of lightning expanding into the waters before them. At that moment, just as the oceanic beasts began to appear one after another, they were first hit by a wave of weakness after entering the fresh water, then right afterward, they were swallowed up by a sea of lightning. The harrowing cries of hundreds of millions of oceanic beasts echoed as the skies flashed with arcs of lightning that pierced downward again and again. Bang! 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 Rumble. The air-grade generals froze, unable to move. They writhed in pain, their skin quickly charring beneath the menacing sea of gold. Lionel calmly took out his bow and pulled back its string taut. The smell of frying flesh filled the air. The gold-grade threats could hardly last a few seconds before they were fried to ash. Only the air-grade threats seemed capable of holding on, but they were entirely paralyzed. To Lionel, they were nothing more than unmoving targets. With an exhaled, Lionel released his arrow, tearing a hole 10 meters across in the head of an enormous colossal squid. Clearing this would be even easier than the first air-grade upgrade challenge. Across the ocean, located on the ocean's floor near an underwater volcano, a city was located. If others had been paying attention, they would be quite shocked, as this underwater city was actually already at the gold grade, a rare find even at this stage. In fact, the only two with such a city were Lionel and Third Nova. Or so most thought. However, at that moment, a large change took place. Orinic's expression changed, but it was already too late. Crack. The city core broke and the entire city was uplifted and shoved outward. They were expelled from the sea, their city forcefully relocated to another section of the ocean. Chapter 2024. Published at 7th of August 2023 1:22 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 2024. An hour. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Orinik stood stunned. What had just happened? He didn't even remotely have a good explanation. The more he thought about it, the more baffled he was. Was it some sort of special reward? But according to his calculations, gold grade should be the highest level city currently. It had to be remembered that the supercontinents only spawned dungeons and challenges equivalent to the territories it was in. This meant that if one wanted a reward higher than the air grade at this point, according to Orinik's calculations anyway, one would have no choice but to enter the ocean. This was the only place that would spawn such challenges ahead of time. Orinik didn't believe that a gold grade reward could expel his city like it had just now, even cracking its city core. Such a thing would completely unbalance the situation. So did that mean that someone had been just lucky enough to clear an air grade dungeon with this sort of reward? But even that didn't make any sense because that would have to mean that they were targeted in specific. They had been completely secretive and had definitely flown under the radar. Plus, who could even reach them currently? They only had such freedom so deep because of the rain beasts. Orinik threw that idea out and assumed that it must be some sort of large area of affectability, but just how large could it be? He didn't believe that anyone could sneak up on them, and they had already claimed a large region with their special territory, so if anything had appeared, they would have been alerted on their territory map the moment someone encroached. In order for them not to notice, the range of such a thing would have had to be enormous, hundreds of kilometers at the very least, and that once again brought him back to his original deduction: it had to be an air-grade reward. But that was impossible. Orinik took a breath and exhaled. Often, the simplest deduction was the right deduction. This chapter upload first at NWSB, C0M. Someone formed an air-grade territory. Not only that, but they succeeded in claiming the entire sea for themselves. As a group with a unique ocean territory, Orinik, of course, knew about claiming a sea. He was actually working as fast as possible to get to that level as soon as possible. But just when he felt like he was getting close, all of his hard work had been destroyed. No, it's not over yet. There were obviously two choices before him. The first was repairing the city through fusion, while the second was attacking the person who had done this to them. At that moment, Richard and Montero flashed over from a distance. They landed in the midst of the ruined and cracked city, their expressions just as ugly as Orinik's. What the hell happened here? Richard asked. We've been targeted. I think someone used an air-grade reward to expel us and claim the sea. How is that possible? Montero's brows jumped. I think you should take a look at, it's unlikely, but it isn't impossible. We've run into upgrade rewards and territory rewards. It's likely that someone was lucky enough to stumble into all three that were needed. Potentially one of the Water Force families. We would have to face off against the Constellation families eventually. You're saying someone managed to gather a unique water territory, which is already rare enough, on top of all of those things? Bullshit. That's the simplest explanation. It's also best that we go forward with this explanation, because if we underestimate the enemy too much, we'll suffer instead. Richard gripped his fists. Why did it feel like every time he was close to succeeding, he would be crushed before he could even fully rise? His gaze burned with a furious light, causing the waters to become agitated. Well, crush them now before they can gain the full benefits of the air-grade territory. They'll be in a lull right after passing such a big trial as well. In addition, although they won't know much about us, their territory map should have alerted them to the fact that they had just pushed a territory out. They won't ever guess that we'll attack them now when we've just suffered a huge blow. Orinik frowned when he heard Richard's words. He could tell that Richard was already slowly losing his patience. However, when Richard continued, his words still seemed to carry some reason. Think about it. Anyone who could find so many rewards in the ocean, albeit lucky, also took quite a bit of effort as well. They've likely taken the same strategy as us in dispersing many of their subordinates into groups to clear as many dungeons and challenges as possible. If they used an upgrade reward to reach the air grade, which makes the most sense, they wouldn't have needed to recall everyone, and they're likely to even expand their radius even further. Now that they had a territory map that expands across an entire sea, there's even more dungeons and challenges to deal with. Before they consolidate and decide to attack other territories with the gains they've made, this is the best chance they'll have, without a doubt. Orinik nodded slowly. Although he had originally felt that Richard was far too eager, after hearing his words, Orinik felt that they held no small bit of logic to them. The reasoning was sound and he couldn't find anything wrong with it immediately. Even if they were wrong and someone had somehow amassed an army that could clear an air-grade upgrade challenge the normal way already, not to mention the point total it cost as well, after fighting such a huge battle, this person would be in quite a sorry state currently. So even in the case he was wrong, there was no better time to attack than now. Orinik nodded slowly. Let's prepare. Chapter 2025. Published at 7th of August 2023 1:22 and 36 seconds p.m. Chapter 2025. Large. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel slowly lowered his bow, his eyes narrowing as he looked off in a certain direction. He looked down and scanned the Sky's family members. They were indeed in a sorry state. They had just maintained their domain of lightning for several hours. Although Lionel's armor made it a lot easier on them, they would need quite a bit of time to recover unless they used the pods. Return to the ice island, Lionel commanded. Unfortunately, the outposts were always tied to a single city, as in the city they were summoned from. As such, Lionel's convenient teleportation network wasn't useful here. He would have to build up another network for this city that could bridge the gap between the two and make it more convenient. He definitely had the funds to do so, but it would take time because one had to personally place the outposts down in their chosen location. In addition to this, Lionel didn't yet know if he would have the points to spare. That was because he now had 3 trillion more points and another city to potentially upgrade. He would have to decide, once again, whether to save what he had or use it immediately. As Lionel had expected, the options weren't many for the Water Lotus territory. So many of the advantages of the territory were baked into it already that giving it any more upgrade paths would be too overpowered and break the balance of the air wars. The only option Lionel gained was one that allowed him to exchange points for a faster closing time. This chapter upload first at NWSB, C0M. This closing time referred to the green pads of the water lotus entering a defensive position. Right now, it took about 8 hours to close the pads and enter the strongest defensive state of the city. He could spend 1 trillion to half that time, 2 trillion to cut it down to 2 hours, and 4 trillion to cut it down to an hour. For every halving, Lionel would have to pay double the points. Other than this, there were no other options to gain. Lionel narrowed his gaze. He was in a bit of a situation now. He had, indeed, sensed that he had expelled someone from his territory. But just like he had sensed them, they had definitely sensed him. If they were smart, their next action would be to attack him with their full force as quickly as possible. His people were, indeed, dispersed, just as Richard had said. In addition, the Sky's family that had fought by his side were too fatigued for another round of battle. It would take them only 15 minutes for the uninjured among them to recover once they returned, but it would take at least an hour to return and an hour to come back to his side. That was 2.5 hours total. Chapter 2026. Published at 7th of August 2023 1:22 and 35 seconds p.m. Chapter 2026. Floating cotton balls. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The scene at the front could only be described as shocking. Hovering above the water, what looked like enormous blue cotton balls floated. Each one of these cotton balls was almost a kilometer across at the smallest, and over 10 at the largest. They looked completely harmless, and yet large tendrils of water streamed upward from the once calm surface with such speed that one could almost witness the surface of the ocean dropping millimeter by millimeter. The amount of water these creatures were absorbing was absolutely shocking, and yet it didn't seem to hinder their movements in the slightest. It was clear that the Water Lotus Territory's debuff was completely useless on these enormous creatures as well, and there were easily thousands of them, stretching as far as the eye could see. If it wasn't for their ridiculous size, Lionel had no doubt that there would be even more. On top of these cotton ball creatures, warriors stood. It was a mixture of Aemon, Itatsi and Viola family members. These people were relatively unknown in the human domain, so much so that many had been questioning why Lionel was sitting in silence and doing nothing at all. They had had no idea that such a lineup was coming until now. Realizing that Lionel was actually planning on facing off against such an army alone, the hearts of the spectators shuddered uncontrollably. As for Orinik and Richard, both were very surprised that the one before them now was actually Lionel. Both had believed that this person would more than likely be from a water force family, but when they saw it was the person they wanted to deal with the most, and better yet he was alone, a cold light suffused their irises. Even so, the unhurried calm in Lionel's gaze was especially grating on their hearts. It felt as though they were reliving some of the most traumatic moments of their lives. The loss of the Void Library token that Lionel had snatched from him seemed simple, but just for a chance to enter as a galaxy-ranked disciple, Orinik had lost count of the number of times he had put his life on the line, how much blood he had shed, how many near-death experiences he had withstood, escaping by the skin of his teeth. This chapter upload first at NWSB, C0M. But without a single regard for anything, Lionel, that boy whose only claim to fame were his parents, had snatched something he had spent years planning for. To this day, that was still the greatest humiliation of his life. He was an exceptionally cautious person, one who only took action when he believed that he had all the cards in his hand, and yet he had been outplayed. For Richard, the hatred was even more deep-seated. His family had been destroyed and uprooted, not just once, but twice. Chapter 2027. Published at 7th of August 2023 1:22 and 34 seconds p.m. Chapter 2027. Sneer. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Richard sneered. Even the unmodified rain beasts, at this size, were practically immune to water force. Let alone water force, because they could expel so much water at once, their defenses were nigh impenetrable. Punching them quite literally felt like punch a large ball of cotton. It wasn't just a look, it was a feature. There was a reason the Rain Galaxy didn't allow them to get this large. Although they were generally harmless, when they grew to a certain size they were almost undefeatable. The only real way to handle them was to take them away from a source of water and allow them to run out of water to use and manipulate, then they would become no less docile than any other domesticated creature. However, Lionel didn't even have this option. Just judging by the closing green pads, Lionel was obviously trying to protect this city. If he wasn't, he would be too foolish. If there was no one here, snatching the city core wouldn't even take any effort at all. Knowing this, how could Lionel lead the rain beasts away from a water source? The entire terrain was the water source. The shore was literally hundreds of kilometers away. Although Lionel had thought about placing the water lotus closer to the shore, he would be giving up its greatest ability in doing this, that being the debuff of fresh water. However, even that was ironically useless in this situation. It had actually taken so much effort just to rip water force from the tsunami wave just now. Lionel couldn't even imagine what it would take to strip them of the water inside their bodies, especially since there were thousands of them easily. There are only two explanations for this. Either these beasts have a massive weakness that I haven't spotted yet, or they were trying to be secretive. Lionel couldn't see how these three had only made this much progress with this kind of trump card. If Lionel had had these rain beasts, not only would he had not needed to expose several trump cards, he would have already claimed the entire ocean for him and would probably be making a move onto the night side continent right this moment. Suddenly, Lionel's gaze flickered. I see, this chapter upload first at NWSB, C0MH. He had found the weakness. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite as groundbreaking as he hoped. This weakness was simply that it took the rain beasts a great deal of time to reach this state. In this state, these rain beasts were easily worth 10,000 points each. It was likely that Orinik and Richard had chosen to exploit the same loophole that the Leo family had and imported them with just 1 point. Due to this, they had to grow these beasts themselves, causing them to waste a lot of time. Mordred's delicate and seductive voice echoed through the starry skies, but even now it was still difficult to tell exactly where it was coming from. Avon's temper was fiery and he almost immediately lashed out. You little harlot. Why don't you come out and say that to my face? Mordred laughed. Joram. Greros. She only spoke out 2 names, but Avon immediately went pale. Under the shocked gazes of all those present, the blustering cross-elder, the man whose temper couldn't be calmed by anyone, suddenly sealed his lips. It was exceptionally nice to listen to, but to Avon's, it felt like nothing more than needle pricking at his eardrums. His fury could have taken tangible form if he allowed it. The ancestors of the various families, even the Morales, couldn't help but frown. Even if Avon remained silent, speculation was impossible to dodge. But at the same time, the place Lionel had in their hearts only elevated. In the beginning, it had felt ridiculous that Lionel could even compete with those of his generation. But now, he was toying even with ancestors of their level, and the worst part was that he didn't even seem to have to be present to do so. Back in the Air Wars, Lionel looked down from the skies. He didn't need to guess the results, he trusted his people and had no need to doubt them. I think you should take a look at whether it was Mordred or Arthur. Both of them not only had ability indexes that were incredibly rare and powerful, they were also gifted the same talent of the people of Earth while also having access to a magic system novel to the human domain. Many of the enemies they faced didn't even know how to face them. The only enemies they had ever struggled against were members of the Cloud race, which were far more talented than most humans to begin with, and members of the four great families, whose strength spoke for themselves. When it came to anyone else, especially within the human domain, they were on a level all to their own. Beneath the eighth dimension, their number of opponents was already very rare. Lionel rolled the rain beast in his hands again. It felt incredibly soft to the touch. He could see why people had adored them as domesticated pets. Even now, he didn't seem to take Orinik and Richard very seriously. Not going to run? Lionel asked lightly. The two clenched their fists so hard that their veins threatened to pop. Their force raged through their nodes and their hearts pumped madly. They had no idea what had happened just now, but the fact that Lionel said capture them made them think that the Morales family had acted on Lionel's orders just now. That made them realize that there was no way out aside from victory. After a moment, Orinik took a breath and exhaled, calming heart. His hands slid into the hems of his robes, one of the very first things he had traded for as a man enamored by his own appearance, and slowly slid them off his shoulders, revealing well cared for dark brown skin and a chiseled physique not very much shy of Lionel's own. Richard began to age quite visibly, but his back was still as straight as a javelin. His beard grew and became wizened and gray, billowing in the wind as the hairs on his head grew more sparse and willowy. Suddenly, a dark force erupted from Orinik that finally made Lionel's eyes narrow. I see. Lionel suddenly said. You're actually a pawn of Third Nova. There was only one place Orinik would teleport to in this moment for safety, and that was Third Nova's territory. If Lionel got caught up in the teleportation, he would be alone in a hostile continent, surrounded by his third eldest cousin's army. Orinik was banking that if he went, Lionel would either be caught up in this trap, or in the case that he realized ahead of time, he would be too scared to go. Either way, he would escape. Lionel sneered, taking a step forward without hesitation. Orinik activated the teleportation, swallowing up all three of them. Over the horizon, Aina and the others just caught up in time to see Lionel vanishing before their eyes. Lionel tilted his head somewhat, his smile light and inviting. But at the moment, it looked like nothing more than a reaper's kiss to Orinik. This chapter upload first at NWSB, C0M, you know, they say that scheming is useless in the face of absolute power, Lionel continued, and I think that's actually true. But the difference is that the definition of absolute power from person to person differs greatly. To you, I've long since reached that level. Against me, no amount of planning, no amount of preparation, no amount of scheming, would be useful. Orinik felt his heart shatter. It wasn't literal, but his body felt like it had lost all of its strength. Hanging in the air, looking into Lionel's eyes, feeling his cold indifference, he realized that the boy back then he could have crushed with a single hand had long since soared well beyond him. If he had only known that the Lionel he met back then was a young man who hadn't even been in the dimensional verse for even a handful of years, he would have understood things much more thoroughly. They had simply never been on the same level. To his surprise, though, Orinik felt his badge shatter. It wasn't him who had done it, but clearly Lionel. Richard's heart was even more dead than Orinik's was. He didn't even react to his badge shattering, the blacks of his eyes sinking deeper and deeper. He had well and truly lost. Orinik felt a sharp pain before he disappeared, feeling that something had been gouged out of his body, but he didn't have the luxury of thinking about it. He already knew that the moment he left, he would find himself in the hands of others. His life was pretty much over now, Lionel didn't care very much about the feelings of the two of them. He had always been a compassionate person, but he was just as easily able to turn it off against the people who targeted him. He didn't blame Richard in the past for what he had done. Back then, when the latter tried to marry Aina, he hadn't even cared to go and stop the marriage in the first place, so how could he retroactively be enraged by such a thing? What he hated Richard for was not for this, but rather the rumors he had spread about his mother. That was simply unforgivable. If it wasn't for Alienor telling him that he was more useful alive back then, Lionel would have long since killed this person. But then he had the audacity to hold a grudge and target the Ascension Empire years later. Then there was Orinik. The rumors he had spread back then about the authenticity of Lionel's amethyst token were true enough. Lionel wasn't enraged by this, he was enraged by the intention behind the action, and then the further steps he took to profit from his and Aina's life and death after they had entered that dangerous zone. The two of them didn't deserve his sympathy and he didn't care for it. They were only alive because they were more useful that way. I think you should take a look at. As for the sharp pain that Orinik had felt before, Lionel looked down at his hand to see a bloody organ. It was a gallbladder of sorts, but this was filled with poison. But what was interesting is that when it was implanted into a body, it worked almost a lot like an innate node would, but this innate node was capable of evolving. It was fascinating. Lionel didn't believe that Orinik had been born with this organ naturally. He had found it by scanning Orinik's body with his dream world, and around the location this was founded, there were almost unnoticeable irregularities. This meant that this wasn't an original part of Orinik's body. Somebody implanted it? So they gave him this ability, he wasn't born with it. But how could it be so seamless? Who has the skill to? Lionel's gaze narrowed. It had to be Third Nova. In fact, it was very likely that Orin had been poisoned as a result of this, and that was why he had lost so easily and silently. Orinik wasn't a demon, but somehow he was able to gain demon-like characteristics through this method. Lionel shook his head. Just what was going on? The Silver Empire had ties to demons. The Morales family had ties to demons. The Suyard family likely had ties to demons. The Three-Finger Cult had ties to demons. What was the story behind this? Was the demon race infiltrating the human domain like the Cloud race had? Something wasn't adding up here, it didn't make any sense to him at all. Why did so many powerful existences have ties to the one race that was the most evil? There wasn't even a religion that worshipped demons, at least not out in the open. This was how against demons the human domain was. Even the spiritual race could have such a religion, but the demons had never been allowed such a thing. And now there were even people creating demons? Lionel was truly speechless. He didn't have an answer for any of these matters. With a frown, he stepped through the air. Beneath him, there was still nothing but vast ocean. He had stepped out of the spatial tunnel long before they made it to the continent, so he actually wasn't very far from the Water Lotus territory. After returning, Lionel saw Aina, who rushed over with a slightly worried expression on her face. However, Lionel only smiled. I have some work for you. Can you create an antidote for this poison? Aina nodded. I can do that. I'll need to send one out of here for Orin. You'll probably need to make it more potent, though. I'm only about 60/40ths on whether or not they use the same poison. But if I'm correct, it's like the same derivatives, but just far more powerful. Aina nodded. She didn't know who Orin was, but she assumed that he must have been Second Nova. Lionel at least kept them updated about certain things. Give me an hour. Those paying attention to this situation were rendered speechless. An hour? They looked toward Orin's body. He had been silent for a long time, but his skin was already turning a terrible black-purple color that wasn't natural in the slightest. Even his sweat had begun to turn toxic and foul. This person was already at a point that only an ancestor of the Omen family could cure him. How could a six-dimensional little girl possibly have a solution in an hour? But under the astonished gazes of those there, Aina actually cut the bloody organ open and swallowed the contents. Chapter 2034. Published at 7th of August 2023 1:22 and 17 seconds p.m. Chapter 2034, where? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again 2034 where? Aina stood in silence for a while, but to the surprise of many, her expression didn't change at all, nor did she erupt into a burst of ash. She didn't seem to have ingested any poison at all. Even if she was immune, she should have at least felt some pain, but she didn't react like that in the slightest. There were certain ability indexes that could allow one to be immune to certain poisons, but everything had their limits. They couldn't fathom why it was that Aina would be so confident. Even those immune to poison wouldn't necessarily go out of their way to consume it, let alone so much of it in a single sitting. Of course, how could these people know that Aina was used to far more pain than this? As a child, she would probably be thankful if she could spend a day with this sort of pain. It wasn't until she consumed Lionel's cleansing waters for the first time that she reached a state where that pain instead became itchiness, which was far easier for her to handle. Plus, Aina had the ability to subconsciously understand everything she was about to put into her body. If she looked at the poison once, she obviously knew the moment she touched it whether it was within her capabilities to handle or not. After several moments, Aina nodded to herself lightly. She listed off quite a few things. At least these territories will be useful for something, Lionel said, looking toward the water lotus territory. All of the previously planned force pills obviously had materials that were likewise previously prepared by Lionel. He wouldn't leave such things up to chance. However, this poison was obviously a curveball, and unlike metals, Lionel didn't have a large supply of force herbs. However, the water lotus territory had them available for purchase. It was a function that he had ignored because it was of little use to him. After all, Aina was the only force pill crafter of adequate skill that Lionel had by his side, and she was already swamped with work. While force herbs could have some effect on their own, those that would be worth it were far too expensive. Lionel was already beginning to feel the pinch of a lack of points currently, so he didn't want to waste the few he had. That said, now, this was a matter of life and death. It wasn't just Oren, but his armies as well. If he wanted to face off against Zavnik, he needed a counter to this poison. If he didn't have one, he might as well pack his bags now. Even he needed a counter. Although he could rely on his innate nodes, it wasn't good enough. This poison still eroded force away, and there were many entry points to his body that it could use. If he had to circulate his force to his innate nodes first before he could get rid of it, over time, the amount of force he would lose in doing this again and again would be too much. Essentially, it would drain his stamina far faster than it should. This chapter upload first at NWSB, C0MIF Orinik had been smarter. He could have used the poison like a continuous domain to drain Lionel over time. But the first problem with that is that draining Lionel is only an option you could take if you were confident in surviving until he was out of stamina. The second problem with that would be Orinik running out of poison. Clearly, this wasn't a natural part of Orinik's body. Aina had to drain the entire rest of the contents to understand everything she could about it. That likely meant that there hadn't been much left. But this didn't mean that Zavnik wouldn't be able to do so. So, Lionel observed Aina very carefully. He had every intention of paying close attention to her changes to see if he could come up with a perfect counter. After buying 2 sets of materials, one for Aina, and another for Anastasia to grow in bulk, Lionel began to watch Aina. She didn't seem to mind. In fact, she felt an odd sort of peace with Lionel watching over her. Although they were in the middle of the ocean, it felt like home. She pressed 2 fingers against her brows and then extended them. From between her brows, a strand of thick reddish gold liquid came out. Just from the faint smell, Lionel knew that it was blood, but aside from that, it also carried the hint of a fragrant flower smell. Those who were watching couldn't help but shudder. A blood refinement method? It wasn't that they had never heard of such a method, but it was so impossibly rare that there wasn't currently even a single other person who could use such methods. In fact, it was so rare that maybe only a handful of others had been capable in the past. All of whom were blood sovereigns. At that moment, the entire atmosphere around Aina seemed to shift. They had vaguely seen already that her strength was abnormal, especially for a 6-dimensional existence, but they had still felt that Lionel was too reckless in taking her as his partner rather than James or someone with more substantial and obvious strength. They thought that Lionel had put too much thought into a statement entrance as opposed to actually surviving. However, these thoughts seemed to fall to silence at this moment, a heavy one. While many still felt that Aina was too weak to have been Lionel's first choice in partner, just this ability alone was enough to be shocking to an extreme. Aina's red-gold blood flew forward and formed a new structure. It took the form of a multi-layered rose with no stem. In place of a stem, there were tendrils of golden roots, stretching out toward the force herbs in the surroundings and enveloping them. I think you should take a look at the gold color seemed to become contagious, moving from the roots and swallowing the force herbs up. As the roots returned to the floating, layered rose, faint bits of dust and ash fell. They were almost imperceptible to the naked eye, but the ancestors of the Omen family couldn't help but feel their hearts skip a beat. Those were definitely the impurities of the force herbs, but that was a process that should have taken several hours, several days even. It could be said that this was the most important step, in fact. This was what would decide the grade of the force pill, even more so than the fusion process. But it seemed like with a simple touch, Aina cleansed the force herbs, leaving them with nothing more than perfection. Or had she? The roots retracted and vanished into the layers of the rose. The rose itself began to gently spin, one after another, its layers collapsed and gained a more and more golden color. A rich fragrance began to fill the air, but the process remained delicate and smooth. The shocking realization that a sixth-dimensional existence had just refined seventh-dimensional force herbs hit the spectators like a speeding meteor. They had been so distracted by everything else that they hadn't had the time to fathom how that could even be possible. Suddenly, the last layer of the rose collapsed and closed softly, leaving the form of what looked like a yet-to-bloom flower. Sparkling motes of golden light gathered from the surroundings, and Aina gently lifted her hand. The grace of their movement left one mesmerized, whether it was the gentle beauty of her long, slender fingers, or the elegance of their movement through the air, either one left one without breath to breathe. And then, the motes condensed. Silence ensued as the rose stopped spinning, its petals opening up one after another to reveal the floating mass of 3 thumb-sized green pills covered in complex purple force arts. Aina smiled lightly, looking up toward Lionel. Finished. Lionel nodded and took the 3 pills. He held 2 between his fingers and palmed the third in his other hand. Looking up toward the skies, his gaze suddenly sharpened as he struck out the palm that held the third force pill. It rocketed through the skies with an inconceivable speed, vanishing through the layers. Up above, Ancestor Alvaro waved a hand and shook his head. He didn't know how this kid sent an item through the barrier, but he really didn't seem to care about the optics. This Lionel was so reckless, but it only made Alvaro chuckle. The only problem was whether this pill would actually work. How could he not be skeptical? He looked toward the Omen family, but they were a blank slate. Even so, the fact they were looking over made Alvaro feel a bit of curiosity. Although Alvaro was hesitating, Kira was most definitely not. She rushed over and demanded the pill, so he could only helplessly release it and watch as she shoved it into Oren's mouth. At this point, Oren's eyes were tightly shut, and he had no understanding of what was happening around him. When he sensed someone prying open his mouth, he wanted to fight back because he thought that it was from the Omen family. He didn't want it. But fortunately, he was too weak at the moment to have a choice. The pill was forced into his mouth, and silence fell. Even the Omen family couldn't help but look over. Despite their earlier confidence, after seeing Aina refine, they couldn't say anything for certain. Just where had this little beauty with such skill come from? Chapter 2035. Published at 7th of August 2023 1:22 and 16 seconds p.m. Chapter 2035. My wife. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2035. My wife. Oren's body suddenly convulsed. Before anyone could react, he shifted violently to his side, dry heaving twice before a sudden belch of grotesque purplish-black gunk flew from his mouth. He vomited again and again, his body unable to contain itself. All of his muscles contracted at once as though the sole purpose of his body was to violently heave again and again. Oren? Oren. Kira wanted to rush forward to help, her tears still streaking down her face, but she was stopped by the other ancestors. "This is a good thing," Ancestor Alvaro said with a peculiar expression. While it looked like Oren's situation had only gotten worse, the fact he was throwing up such foul material meant that his body was actually actively purging itself. For those who didn't quite understand force pill crafting, this was still quite novel. But to those that did, it was absolutely shocking to the greatest degree. This was akin to the difference between medicine and a vaccine. Aina's pill wasn't just curing Oren, it was giving his body the tools it would need to survive this poison should he ever encounter it again. Normal detoxification pills might target the poison and neutralize it, then over the next several moments to even days, weeks, and even years, the now benign poison would be slowly excreted through normal waste removal procedures. However, the effects of Aina's pill were strong and immediate, and it could be seen that it was using Oren's body as the engine to drive the change. This was fundamentally on a different level. To not only medicate an illness but to give one the power to counter it. And to do it with a poison she had only just come in contact with. The shock was strong and immediate. The ancestors of the Omen family were stunned silent. There was only one grade of pill that could do this. Due to Aina's odd refinement method, it had been difficult to tell. Unlike with crafts, there were simply too wide a range of possibilities for force pills. One could exhibit their skill in anything from culinary skills to potion making, all the way to the creation of actual pills. Due to the wide range, it was difficult even for experts to grasp the methods of another taking a different path from them immediately. But now, they were absolutely certain. Lionel's team didn't have just one life-grade crafter, it had two. And both of them were in the 6th dimension. This chapter upload first at NWSB, C0 Ma life-grade force pill crafter was even rarer than a life-grade force crafter. In fact, in the whole human domain, there were only 3 of them, and 2 of them were on the side of the spiritual religion faction, while the final was the most senior ancestor of the Omen family. There were no blueprints for life-grade force pill crafting, and the methods of refinement tended to change on the day-to-day basis and even took into consideration the person who would be consuming it. If a life-grade treasure was able to be a single cohesive unit, akin to a creation of the universe itself, a life-grade pill was designated as a product of the reaction it had in the person who consumed it. Essentially, a life-grade force pill was capable of eliciting a life-grade level change in the body of the person who consumed it. In the past, Oren had been clearly vulnerable to this poison. But from now on, he would be entirely immune to it. This was the power of the life-grade force pill and maybe the most immediate and shocking change. However, this wasn't anywhere near the first time Aina had done this. Back in the Cataclysm Zone, when she refined the demons into force pills that caused permanent and foundational changes to Lionel's body, this was also an example of a life-grade change. Adding to one's strength was easy as a force pill crafter, but improving one's foundation and reworking efforts they had accumulated in the past was on an entirely different level. A crafted treasure would always be an external item, but a force pill that could so fundamentally change the very anatomy of a person was akin to a holy grail. These sort of pills could build armies, they could make up for weaknesses. They could even create lineage factors. And yet, this little girl in their eyes, with so much strength and potential at her fingertips, happily smiled at Lionel and followed along with him without a word. At that moment, the name Aina suddenly skyrocketed to the top of every list imaginable. Even the likes of Cynthia had never been able to compare, even at her height. The difference was large and obvious, plainly so. Cynthia was a force crafter and a force pill crafter. However, while she was a life-grade force crafter, the life grade of force pill crafting had evaded her grasp for countless decades now. She had long since entered the 8th dimension, and yet this 6th-dimensional young lady had already surpassed her. I think you should take a look at the weight of this matter was absolutely enormous. If the Morales family crowned Lionel as their next patriarch, didn't this mean that the Morales family would gain Aina as well? The value of such a thing was beyond Aina herself, but what experiences she had. Couldn't she guide a generation of force pill crafters for the Morales family? The most shocking part of all of this was the fact that Aina didn't have the guidance of anyone. The Omen family had produced life-grade force pill crafters in the past. Their documented experiences were all there for their future generations to benefit from. The spiritual religion also benefited from such a thing, not to mention the fact their race made them more in tune with the life grade to begin with. However, who had guided Aina? She had made it to this level all alone. The unique insights she likely had were things that the others had probably never even heard of. Setting aside her blood sovereignty, just this matter alone was enough to make the eyes of many light up with absolute greed. Suddenly, the air wars that were designed for the future generation of leaders had been co-opted by a young woman who wasn't even among the heirs. She could have very well created her own force. Just on the virtue of her status as a force pill crafter, leagues of people would flock over from all walks of life. But here she was, looking at Lionel now, many couldn't help but feel annoyed. How had this happened? Oren heaved one last time before his eyes snapped open, the shock within evident. Others didn't know much about this poison, but he most definitely did. He could feel that his tolerance toward it had shot way up, and on top of that, he was already in tip-top shape. If it wasn't for the fact his muscles were a bit sore from the contractions and his force had yet to be replenished, he would even say that he was at 100%, 110% even. Who? How? Oren was the leader of an information network. He had information about all sorts of things and was knowledgeable on even more topics. He understood that the pill he had just consumed wasn't a normal gold-grade force pill, but the Omen family only had one life-grade force pill crafter. It couldn't be that that person had come out, right? That didn't make sense. Ancestor Hito hadn't. It was because they didn't do business with humans, especially not the most powerful among them. They wouldn't even consider it. If it wasn't for the fact they were so powerful, this eyesore of the human domain would have been dealt with a long time ago. The shock that Oren was already speaking and moving about hit like another train. Those around had already lost the words to speak. All they could do was look toward the air wars, their hearts shuddering. Not a day had passed by without Lionel giving them a surprise that left them in complete silence. Just how many more surprises did he have? Lionel descended from the skies above and then toward Aina with a light smile. "They're jealous of my wife," he said in a joking tone he hadn't used in a while. To Lionel, the most important thing would always be Aina. He had been willing to doom the world for her. So how could he maintain his seriousness toward the air wars to her detriment? What Queen Beauty list? Could such a list even be allowed to exist if his Aina wasn't number one? Let alone the fact she hadn't even been on it to begin with. How could such a list have any sort of integrity? Aina rolled her eyes. "Stop playing around, there's still work to do." "Yes, ma'am," Lionel said with a laugh. "But first, those people with no life better make sure that my wife is the number one Queen Beauty from now on." Aina scoffed and forcefully took Lionel's hand, a sweet smile blooming on her face when she turned to pull him away. Chapter 2036. Published at 7th of August 2023 1:22 and 14 seconds p.m. Chapter 2036. Toying if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 2036. Toying. Lionel's words sounded like a joke, but he was actually quite serious. He didn't believe anyone should be ahead of Aina, and that probably had little to do with how she actually looked. If he had seen a physical manifestation of the Queen Beauty list without Aina's name on it, he would have destroyed it on sight. Luckily for the list and its voters, though, Lionel had never actually stumbled upon it. As such, they got away with a light scolding instead. Despite this matter already being considered to be over, the rippling waves that it caused didn't seem intent on settling down anytime soon. But even beyond the existence of Aina herself, the Morales family and their speculation about Oren was a different matter entirely. After Oren had regained his bearing, sitting up, and eventually standing up under his own power, he found that everyone was around him, their gazes questioning much of what they had seen. Lionel's voice was quite clear when he mentioned Third Nova. If both Orinik, a supposed subordinate of Zavnik, had this poison, and Oren had also fought a mysterious existence that poisoned him with the same thing, it was clear how these two things might be connected. Although it was just a casual word on Lionel's part, even the ancestors of the Morales hadn't realized that they had begun to subconsciously believe in even these casual words. Lionel himself had begun to hold a weight that he hadn't in the past, and the cascading effects of that matter were only growing more obvious by the day. Oren, though, still didn't seem to have any intention in exposing anything. With a smile, he only said that it wasn't Zavnik's fault. After all, they were in battle. Considering his state of weakness, had Zavnik wanted to kill him, he would already be dead. The Morales ancestors seemed to accept this explanation as well. After all, Oren couldn't even move, and there weren't exactly rules against using poison in the air wars, and it also wasn't like others hadn't had near-death experiences in the past as well. Plus, Zavnik didn't have the same abilities Lionel had to communicate through the barriers and send things, so it made sense that he didn't send any antidote. He didn't have the capability in the first place. So with that, things seemed to have been concluded. It was only Kira who stood in silence with a furrowed brow, her face still very much hidden behind a mask that only revealed the slits of her eyes. She knew that this failure weighed a lot heavier than Oren had let on. They had been preparing for this matter for a long while, and since this approach had failed, it meant that they would need to take the measures that Oren hadn't wanted to now. While this matter was settling, the lives of Orinik and Richard had seemingly been forgotten. With the distraction that Aina had provided, everyone was too enamored to realize that the flagships of the Aemon family and Viola family had a striking lack of their patriarchs despite the fact they had been ejected long before Aina had sent out the force pill. Now, there were three. Richard, Orinik, and Montero were all chained, stranded in a foggy world of black that left them breathing hard. It felt like every time they tried to fill their lungs with air, a weight would be pressing down on their chest, slowing down their attempt. It made it exceptionally difficult for them to catch their breaths, and even worse than that, they had the uncomfortable feeling that they couldn't take a deep breath at all. This matter left them unsettled, and their eyes continuously darted around as though they couldn't even see one another despite the fact they were sitting side by side. This chapter upload first at NWSB, C0 Mat. That moment, a beauty stepped out from the shadows and gazed upon them one after another. But what made their eyes widen was the absolute monstrosity standing by her side. He must have been at least 4 meters tall, with skin as red as blood and muscles as tight as steel cords. He had 4 arms and a set of jet black horns that were almost impossible to pick out in the darkness. If not for the redness of the skin causing them to spot the abnormality, they might not have realized that this creature had horns at all. Of them all, Orinik was the most shocked. That was because while Richard and Montero only felt fear, Orinik felt not only fear but an understanding toward the kind of creature that was before him. There was no doubt in his mind, this was a demon, a true-blooded demon. He almost fainted, flashbacks of a past he wanted to forget running through his mind with no regard for his peace or sanity. The hole in his stomach from where Lionel had ripped out his poison sac began to ooze with thick, black blood. As a seventh-dimensional existence, that sort of wound, especially since he hadn't lost any vital organs, shouldn't have left him so vulnerable. He could last for a long while even if it was never treated, weeks or months even. Even if he had to continue to battle, he could do so. But given his state of agitation, he seemed to be making the situation far worse. If others knew what he knew, they would likely be reacting like this as well. He felt as though he wasn't a chess piece on just a single board, but many of them, and it was suffocating him down to his very core as though several hands were wrapped around his heart. Mordred raised an eyebrow and then waved a hand. An arm of darkness manifested and slapped Orinik across the face, snapping him out of his panic attack. Orinik was many things, but weak-minded wasn't one of them. It was just that the current situation was a lot for him to bear given his past. That was because if they mated with a powerful existence, their child was guaranteed to be powerful as well, something even the most powerful of spirituals couldn't guarantee. This sort of chaos of choice and possibility is exactly what the demon race embodied, and it was where their strength came from. And now, somehow, such an existence was before Orinik. Given what he knew, how could he not feel like he had been played for a fool? From the very beginning, Zavnik had been toying with him, that had to be it. Chapter 2037. Published at 7th of August 2023 1:22 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 2037. A single line. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2037. A single line. This matter seemed to be a simple matter. The ability to guarantee a powerful offspring so long as one was a true-blooded demon didn't seem to be a big deal. After all, there were powerful children born to powerful parents all the time. Wasn't that the purpose of lineage factors to begin with? Wasn't that why certain races seemed to be stronger than others? Wasn't that how things worked anyway? But no, this wasn't true. Of the current 7 Morales heirs, only 2 had fathers who had participated in previous years, Lionel and Adaworth. Even when one lost the heir wars, one would still be extremely powerful. Many of the current ancestors of the Morales family were former losers of the heir wars. Such individuals were still people with 2 lineages, still people with a great amount of talent. They would still be greatly nurtured, they would still be greatly beloved. These were men who would often have many wives, and many more children than that. And yet, there were only 2 who had such previous lineages. In fact, this matter was such an anomaly that the fact Lionel's line had produced 3 in a row of exceptional talent was almost unheard of, not to mention the fact that Lionel's father's generation actually had 2, his father and his uncle, both from the same father, his grandfather. This was why the human race was so far behind others. It wasn't just that they had too many paths to follow and pick from and didn't have a single set leader, it was also that because they weren't all following the same path, the odds of producing exceptional talents in a certain path were also lower. Other races, not only had trillions upon trillions to bolster their population, but because they followed pretty much a single set path, there was a larger pool of talents to gather from as a result. In the human domain, a child who had great affinity with the Morales way of practicing might be born in a small 6-dimensional family who practiced lightning force, and because they had no talent in lightning force, they would have to forge their own path outside of the set plans of their family. This was a problem one would see again and again. In the demon race, though, once a true-blooded demon was born, the path and talent of the future child could be hand-selected. This made true-blooded demons, or chaos demons, the nobles of their race regardless of their personal strength. This was the main difference. Although the demon race followed countless paths, just like humans, because they could hand-select and practically create the talents they wanted, the effect it had on them weakened significantly. In fact, they got the best of both worlds, both a great deal of versatility and a great deal of talent. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M. The weight of this matter was something that Orinik was all too familiar with, that was why he felt that he had been played. From the very beginning, he was caught in an internal struggle of the demon race and he hadn't even known. Of course, this conclusion was entirely false because Lionel's demons had nothing to do with the demons of Zavnik and potentially the hidden underbelly of the Morales family. The two were entirely unrelated. But how could Orinik know that these demons had come from a mythological zone and not the demon domain? Mordred, who had been asked to interrogate Orinik and the others by Lionel, fell into contemplation. She was quite an intelligent woman. The moment she had seen Orinik's reaction, she knew that something was wrong. Things weren't adding up. After all, Orinik had the poison sac of a demon transplanted into his body. Could he really be this scared just by seeing one in person? And then there was this true-blooded demon name, she had never heard of it. There was clearly something much more astonishing going on here than she had originally assumed. Why don't you tell me what you know and we can make your life a little comfortable? Mordred bent down, balancing her thighs on the heels of her feet. Smelling her orchid-like breath at such a close distance, Orinik felt his heart stampeding in his chest. He had never been so sensitive in the past, and he had seen a lot of beautiful women, but right now his mind was in a mess and his body was in survival mode. Control was the last thing he had. To her surprise, Orinik actually spilled everything. Orinik, though, didn't think he had much of a choice. That was because, in his mind, if demons were here, and Zavnik was also with the demons, they must be wrestling for control over the Morales family. Now that he had been captured, Zavnik would never trust him again, while these demons probably knew enough about these matters that his small bit of information wouldn't move the needle much. After all, they were basically on the same side anyway. I think you should take a look at. There was a large difference between the clashing interests of internal struggle and the outside pressure of two enemies with vastly different family cultures clashing. As Mordred listened, she only became more and more serious. By the end of it, her body was tense and her lips were pressed into a thin line. The worst part of all of this wasn't the facts of what Orinik had said, but rather that what he knew was likely nothing more than the tip of the iceberg, and yet it could still make her feel so apprehensive. Mordred stood to her feet. "Look after them." She said this only out of habit. Considering they were within her shadow world now, these three simply had nowhere to go unless their comprehension of either dark force or spatial force was deep enough, and clearly, it wasn't. After a while, she passed on the information she had gained to Lionel. Lionel had been focused on gaining control over a third sea as quickly as possible. The fact that Orinik and the others had been so close made his sense of urgency even greater than it had been in the past. It was actually good news that Orinik was tied to Zavnik, because that more than likely meant that Zavnik's greatest investment into the ocean was co-opted by Lionel, but that was enough for Lionel to relax in the slightest. In fact, it was very much possible that Orinik wasn't his greatest investment at all. It was hard to tell just how deep Zavnik's schemes ran, and while Lionel only had a few months to prepare, Zavnik had had over 2 decades. The gap was tremendous. However, when Lionel got word back from Mordred, everything came to a stop. He stood in the middle of the ocean in silence, his mind running 1,000,000 miles a minute. Mordred's information confirmed all of his speculation, but it had also added something he hadn't known about in the first place, and that was a secret of the Morales family's Holy Land. Orinik didn't know anything about the specifics. All he knew was that the root of the Morales family's metal synergy lineage factor was likely hidden within. Only Morales ancestors were allowed to enter this deep, as it held the key to unlocking the final door of their lineage factor. The problem was that most didn't succeed, and all of the current Morales ancestors except for one still only had 7th-dimensional metal synergy lineage factors. That one person was Ancestor Hito, and he was one of the very few to have succeeded. The target of Zavnik and the others was entry into this place, and that required a change in the rules of the Morales. Until now, only ancestors had been able to appear, but because of a change that seemed to create a door beyond the 8th-dimensional door, opening the gates to the 9th dimension, there was no better chance than now to loosen the rules of the Morales. When Lionel had learned of this, he realized that Zavnik had likely gotten this opportunity because of him. Who else could have been responsible for the creation of the final door if not him? However, he didn't blame himself too much. The fact that Zavnik and his faction had been planning this for so long meant that whether or not he had caused this, they would have acted without a doubt. But the question was, what was the goal? Were they trying to steal it? But if stealing was their goal, why loosen the rules in the first place? Did they think it would be easier if the Morales were more lax with their regulations? Suddenly, Lionel froze. He thought back to the connection between the Silver Empire's lineage factor and the Morales families, and then further about the Silver Empire's connection with the Three-Finger Cult. Could it be that this secret of the Morales was similar to the chalice, the fire, and the wooden ball?